刚好在2020年，有关中国现代史的研究特别丰富。Arnab、Gina 和 David 新发表的书都是有代表性的例子。他们的研究题目和研究方法都很不一样，但是他们的书都以丰富的史料来追求独创性的研究方向，而且都是引起学术界关注的重要研究成果。中国现代史的境况怎样？有什么新方向、新发现和新领域呢？新发表的中国历史研究又怎么帮助我们了解现今中国在世界体系所扮演的角色？通过这3位学者的演讲，我们可以对这些问题做出反思。在最后的综合讨论和 Q&A， 我们也可以结合他们的研究来探讨历史学者应该如何回应今天的挑战。那让我先介绍一下今天的3位演讲者。第一位演讲者是哈佛大学历史系的副教授 Arnab Ghosh。Arnab 也是我哥伦比亚大学历史系的学长。他的研究领域包括20世纪的中国社会、经济和环境史、跨国科学史和中国印度关系的历史。Ghosh 教授今天会跟我们分享他由 Princeton University Press 发表的书 Making It Count: Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China 算术共和国早期的统计学与国家治理。我们的第2演讲者是三一大学历史系助理教授 Gina Ann Tam。他的研究领域是现代中国的集体认同，包括国家、民族和种族的认同。Tam 教授今天会跟我们讲述他有 Cambridge University Press 出版的书 Dialect and Nationalism in China 1860 to 1960 中国方言与民族主义1860年到1960年。最后是香港科技大学历史系副教授 David 程昌。他的研究领域是韩战、冷战与中美关系的历史。程教授今天要跟我们分享他有 Stanford University Press 出版的书 The Hijacked War: The Story of Chinese POWs in the Korean War 被劫持的战争，中国人民志愿军战俘台湾与韩战。3位学者发表完以后，我们会进行综合讨论和问答。政治大学历史系的蓝诗琪教授会对3位学者的演讲发表他的看法和提问，然后剩下的时间我们会进行 Q&A。欢迎观众的各位用Google Meet 的举手功能，就是那个 Raise Hand button， 然后我们会按次序的邀请各位发问，或者大家也可以用 Chat 的功能随时发表你的问题。今天的会议是中英双语进行的，观众的各位可以用国语或者英文提问都可以。好的，那我们先要很荣幸的邀请 Professor Arnab Ghosh 开始发表。Arnab, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Okay. 好，那非常感谢 Jack 你给我们那么丰富的一个介绍。那我准备的就是一个英文的那个演讲，所以不好意思不能用中文。现在就是今天不能用中文来做演讲，但是以后就是在我们讨论的时候，我们可以就是随便用中文不好意思用国语和英文。好，那我开始吧。所以 thank you so much, Jack, again, for this kind introduction, and to the history department at Goli Zhengzhi Dashue. I've been to Taipei a few times before, but never to Goli Zhengzhi Dashue, so it's nice, even though it's a virtual visit, it's still nice to be able to visit. So I need to, I guess, share my screen. Let me do that very briefly. Hang on, I'm having trouble seeing my... For some reason, I don't see my PowerPoint as an option to share. Sorry.
Do you
I think it'll present now if you choose share a window.
A window?
Yeah, I tried that. It's not showing me. I don't know why it's not showing me that. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay, now it says my Google Chrome is not responding. I don't know what happened suddenly.
So you can
let me maybe just try and restart the Google Chrome. Sorry about this.
We're ahead of schedule, so take your time.
Hi, Jack, can you hear me? I still am having,
yes.
Like it worked perfectly fine on Wednesday, but I'm having trouble. Oh, wait a minute. Here we go.
Great.
Okay, can you see this? Can you see everything?
Yay,
yes.
I can see it.
Okay, it's on full screen now?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, good. Sorry about that, everyone, and sorry for eating into the time. But let me dive right in. So thanks again. I'm here to tell you today a little bit about my book, as Jack just mentioned, Making Account Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China, which was published earlier this year in March. What I'd like to do today is to draw upon some of the key strands in the book to offer a narrative of statistics and statistical work in the 1950s. Some of the themes that I'll touch upon include the expansion of state capacity and the challenges to it, new ways to think about scientific cooperation during the early Cold War, and the place of early PRC statistical history within the history of 20th century quantification. So needless to say, in half an hour, I can only offer a very sort of small taste. But my hope is that what I say might be enticing enough to at least some of you that you'll want to pick up and read the rest of the book. So to start with, I want to share two vignettes that are separated by about a decade and a half. The first is set in 1974. That year, Leo Orleans, then the China research specialist at the United States Library of Congress, wrote a short article pithily entitled Chinese Statistics, the Impossible Dream. In the article, Orleans, who just actually passed away earlier this year, Orleans described Chinese statistics as notorious and the Chinese as a nation that does not value accuracy. He went on to explain that the Chinese themselves lack much of the statistical data we so desperately seek, and that their traditional nonchalance toward accuracy in statistics persists among many of the people presently responsible for record keeping. So not surprisingly then, the mainstream response in the West to the problem of Chinese data has been characterized by a tendency to not take Chinese statistics too seriously. This was true in 1974, and as you know from following a lot of the news on the Chinese economy and also, of course, on COVID-19, it remains true today. So that's the first vignette that I wanted to share. The second vignette takes us even further back in time to 1959. That year, the State Statistics Bureau of the People's Republic of China compiled a volume entitled 伟大的10年, 10 Great Years. Part of nationwide celebrations to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, the volume declared that an epic of world-shaking importance, forever worthy of being recalled, had been scripted. A smattering of text did little to distract from the substance of the book. You have page after page after page full of numbers, tables, and charts. A veritable barrage of statistical data, all corralled to provide indisputable proof that the Chinese people had indeed experienced 10 years of rebirth, 10 years of leaping progress in economy and culture. So quite a different picture from the one painted by Orleans just 15 years later in 1974. What's interesting is, of course, that implicit in both of these vignettes is the assumption that there exists a neutral, untainted truth that numbers can accurately and unequivocally capture. That it is just a matter of doing the job properly and with all seriousness. But statistics are rarely only about the numbers and their truth claims. They exist at the crossroads where mathematical certainty encounters the messiness of quantifying and categorizing the inherently imprecise characteristics of human existence and activity. So indeed, statistics are neutral only if we accept that how we come to know something has no bearing on what we know, and of course, vice versa. The 1950s were witness to arguably the most vigorous disagreement over this question of what and how. As the world emerged from the devastation of the Second World War and entered a period of decolonization and imperial collapse, countries both old and new reposed great faith in the authority of quantitative methods and statistics. Collecting and analyzing data using advanced statistical methods came to define modern governance. This shared faith, however, did not always translate into shared methods. Refracted through an increasingly thick Cold War lens, the universal desire for ever-increasing quantitative control splintered, taking forms that not only varied significantly, but were often seen as each other's correctives, sort of correctives to each other. And the PRC was at the heart of these disagreements. In making it count, in Suanshu, I therefore take statistics from the first decade of the PRC seriously. How did a state that promised to fundamentally re-engineer society and economy via socialist planning count and know itself and the country? After all, planning requires data, and good planning presumably requires good data. In the answers to these questions emerges a new understanding of the Chinese Communist project and its links to the wider world. A shift in focus away from questions of accuracy, which is typically which has been the principal object of earlier scholarship, which seems to drive also, of course, a lot of contemporary scholarship. But a shift in focus away from these questions of accuracy creates space to interrogate instead how statistics, a putatively neutral field, became the site for a fundamental theoretical battle about the nature of social reality. In October 1949, buoyed by their victory and confident of the transcendence of Marxism-Leninism, the communists set about transforming China. Few, if any, were more optimistic. But the great promise of improvement also helped rationalize repressive and violent measures, leaving behind scars both physical and psychological. Powerful and progressive reforms, such as the redistribution of land to peasants and the enactment of a new egalitarian marriage law, coexisted with the need to discipline and subdue different sections of society, from bureaucrats to merchants, and of course also to intellectuals. The final campaign of the decade brought the story full circle. A terrible famine devastated the same peasants that had so spectacularly been empowered just 10 years earlier. Across this vivid canvas then, the story of statistics, subject to benign neglect at the best of times, one could argue, ought not to occupy pride of place. And yet, as I discovered, it lies at the heart of China's socialist experiment in the 1950s. Ever since their miraculous escape from nationalist armies in 1934, the communists had sought to distinguish themselves as a party and a movement with a difference. From their new base in the dusty hills of north-central China, they began experiments in communist governance, balancing practical and ideological objectives. Recruitment of a peasant army, land reform, and cadre training were accompanied by the creation of a distinct Marxism-Leninism-inspired theoretical apparatus. And after 1949, as they took control of the mainland, they were in a position to act on their long-time claims to difference. And few domains demonstrated as clean a break from the past as did statistics. In a speech in 1951, Li Fuchun, one of a handful of technocratically minded leaders, summarily dismissed the utility of nationalist-era statistics, explaining that in the past, China was a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country. Strictly speaking, it did not possess any statistics worth speaking of. Statistics in old China was learned from the Anglo-American bourgeoisie. This kind of statistics cannot serve as our weapon. It is unsuitable for the tasks of managing and supervising the country. We need to build a new statistics for a new China. A new kind of statistics China did indeed fashion, and it offered emphatic answers to the essential questions of what to count and how to count. At the heart of the matter was a contentious debate about the very nature of social reality and the place and efficacy of mathematical statistics, in particular probability theory, in ascertaining that reality. This debate played out against a backdrop populated by three very divergent methodological approaches to statistics and statistical work. As a useful shorthand, let us label these approaches the ethnographic, the exhaustive, and the stochastic. Each of these approaches answered differently the question of how best to count and had implications for the types of data that were collected, as well as for the methods used to collect and analyze data. The resolution of the debate meant that for much of the decade, it was the exhaustive approach that dominated. But the ethnographic and the stochastic also enjoyed moments of contrasting prominence. From the perspective of PRC statisticians, the most indigenous amongst these approaches, because it could be traced to Mao's 1927 report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan, as well as to later essays that he wrote, such as on book worship and on practice, was the ethnographic approach. As its label suggests, it relied on a method that placed the researcher in the middle of the people and the phenomenon he was surveying. His personal presence on the ground, interacting in depth with people, observing and recording phenomena firsthand, these were deemed as indispensable to his ability to understand the objective reality of any place and any situation. Such a typical or paradigmatic understanding could then be extrapolated to produce wider, more comprehensive knowledge of social, economic, or cultural trends. So direct experience was necessary because it alone was the source of the surveyor's authority. Now, for those of you who have done social survey research, you will know that we can recognize this as a form of qualitative sampling, essentially. This is an important methodology that continues to undergird vast domains of social science and historical research today. And of course, it has a long history of use within statistical work as well. The most pervasive amongst the three approaches was the exhaustive, because it was both the de jure and the de facto approach to statistics during much of the 1950s. Less dominant in subsequent decades, it nonetheless continued to serve as the basis of statistical theory and practice in China into the early 1980s. The exhaustive approach was based on defining statistics as a social science, as opposed to a natural science or a universal science. Most significant to this definitional distinction was the rejection of mathematical statistics, in particular of probability theory, and its attentions to questions of randomness and chance. Instead, drawing direct inspiration from developments in the world of Soviet statistics, the resultant approach, which one can call socialist statistics, favored exhaustive enumeration through periodic complete counts, essentially a census method. This rejection of probability was based on a narrow reading of Marxism's explicit teleology. In the eyes of Chinese and Soviet statisticians, there was nothing uncertain about mankind's march towards socialism and then, of course, eventually communism. What role then could probability or randomness play in the study of social affairs? The dominance of exhaustive enumeration was instrumental in the shaping of new bureaus, the designing of regimes of statistical work, and in the training of personnel. It also generated tremendous incapacities. A country as large and as diverse as China was not easy to enumerate. And these are all topics that I cover in some length, at some length in the book. The last of the three approaches, the stochastic, was also the youngest. Unlike qualitative sampling or the census method, which had been around in some form for millennia, it was only a few decades old. It relied explicitly on recent advances in mathematical statistics and probability theory to promote what was in the 1950s a contentious but exciting new technology, large-scale random sampling. Compared to exhaustive enumeration, large-scale random sampling carried the promise of not only generating more accurate data, but also of being both cheaper and faster. So, for example, if done properly, a 1% or 2% random sample survey could help you get more reliable information than a census, so it was contended. Each of these approaches offered specific advantages, but each also had its limitations. The ethnographic was easily biased. The exhaustive was frequently inefficient, and in certain sectors, such as agriculture, also quite impracticable. And finally, the stochastic was technically demanding and still mired in theoretical and methodological controversy. No single method was a panacea, a fact that is true today as much as it was in the 1950s. A more capacious approach, employing a judicious mix of all three, would quite possibly have allowed the Chinese state to have a better sense of its activities and its achievements. But for most Chinese statisticians, such a capacious approach remained elusive or downright theoretically unacceptable through much of the 1950s. The implications for statistical methods of these kinds of choices and the debates and the preference for exhaustive enumeration, the implications were quite profound. In rejecting probability and the larger area of mathematical statistics within which it belonged, China's statisticians discarded a large array of techniques, none more critical than the era's newest and most exciting fact-generating technology, large-scale random sampling. Instead, they decided that the only correct way to ascertain social facts was to count them exhaustively. Only in this way could extensive, complete, and objective knowledge be generated. So out of these sort of distinctions and this understanding emerged a strict hierarchy of methods. At the top was complete enumeration, realized through a vast system of comprehensive and periodic reports covering all sectors of the economy, which the Chinese term the Chuanmian Dingqi Tongji Baobiao Zhidu. Next came one-time censuses, which were used to collect data on an ad hoc or as-needed basis. So, your classic pucha. Finally, only in those circumstances when an exhaustive count wasn't possible, did Chinese statisticians also use non-randomized, that is, ethnographic modes of sampling. And then you had a variety of them that I've encountered. You had typical sampling, Dianqing Diaocha, you had quota sampling, Dinge, Chouyang, and purposive sampling, it's Youyi Diaocha. So you have a whole range that were experimented with. Now, in standard Chinese chronologies, 1949 to 1952 is described as the period of economic recovery, and then 1953 to 57 are the periods of the first 5-year plan. The plan itself consisted of a plethora of constituent parts, broken into annual, semi-annual, and then quarterly timeframes, which planners applied to the entire socio-economic landscape. In its idealized form, the state would then collect data from all spheres of society. The headquarters of the State Statistics Bureau, established in Beijing in 1952, was divided into 13 branches dealing with industry, agriculture, capital construction, trade, distribution of supplies, transportation, labor wages, culture, education, and publication. Each of these branches received data that had made their way up progressively from villages to counties to provincial bureaus, and then, of course, eventually to Beijing. In Beijing, the data were further collated and compiled and then sent to the State Planning Commission. These plans were then sent back down the same route to provincial, municipal, and county planning offices, and then through them to the corresponding statistics offices. At its mid-decade peak, so about 1956, this system of statistical data collection employed at least 200,000 full-time cadre spread across 2,200 counties and 750,000 villages. The supremacy of planning was accompanied by a particular emphasis on material production and a corresponding neglect of service-based activities, such as administration, retail, and accounting. It also generated a hierarchical relationship between the two most important sectors of the economy. Although the communist revolution was won by peasant armies, economic policy as a whole placed primary emphasis on the rapid growth of heavy industries. Agriculture, which constituted nearly 50% of the economy in 1949, was relegated to the background, its primary task to generate surplus for investment in heavy industries. So the scale of the statistical operation, the privileging of material production, and within that, the emphasis on heavy industry and relative neglect of agriculture, all of these factors combined to ensure that the dream of total information, so alluring as an ideal, was a nightmare in practice. Every level of the statistical system contributed to the overproduction of data. And in a system that valued the production of material goods above all else, the only way a white-collar service such as statistics could draw attention to itself was by claiming, as a statistical worker did indeed claim in 1955, that statistical tables were a material contribution to the economy. So in what may well be the most romantic statement ever uttered about statistics, this worker said, "Every time I complete a statistical table, my happiness is like that of a peasant on his field catching sight of a golden ear of wheat. My excitement like that of a steel worker observing molten steel emerging from a Martin furnace. And my elation like that of an artist completing a beautiful painting." So with the production of tables so incentivized, the entire system responded with gusto. Soon, there were so many reports circulating that it was impossible to keep track of them. And internal memoranda bemoaned the chaos. But in the end, it was a pithy 4-character phrase that truly captured the exasperation that many statisticians felt. Translated, it really reads as useless at the moment of creation. So the tables, they said, were useless at pretty much the moment they were created. Compounding the problem of overproduction was the issue of data irreconcilability. All too often, provincial bureaus or headquarters in Beijing encountered disparate numbers for a given product. The State Statistics Bureau issued catalogs of industrial products in the hopes of achieving some kind of standardization, but this was to no avail. Overproduction and irreconcilability of statistical data in turn fueled chronic delays. Nowhere were these problems as pronounced as in the agricultural sector. Already neglected under the prevailing industry-centric orientation, the scale of the agricultural sector and the large variation in terrain, in crops, and seasons compounded the tendency to overreport, delay, and generate incommensurable data. And the waves of collectivization that began in 1952 and forced villages into larger and larger collectives also exacerbated the problem of reliable and standardized data. So out of these circumstances emerged what I like to call data's own uncertainty principle, hearkening to the much more famous Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in quantum physics. And this principle basically says accuracy and timeliness are always in conflict. Prioritizing precision in one typically meant compromising precision in the other. If numbers weren't provided at the right time, decision-making, of course, suffered. But what good would those decisions be if the numbers themselves were of poor quality? This paradox was debilitating. In September 1957, the head of the State Statistics Bureau, Xiao, broke the deadlock by declaring, in order for the leading authorities to understand the situation, research questions, and decide on policies, they frequently need reference data on a timelier basis. Such data need not possess a high degree of accuracy or be comprehensive, but it must be supplied in a timely fashion. So the cat of estimation was now among the pigeons of accuracy. Higher levels of the statistical system set ever stricter deadlines, and the lower levels responded with more and more estimated numbers. As these numbers traveled up the chain from county to province to Beijing, they were combined with other estimates, leaving provincial and eventually national data with ever larger margins of error. By 1957, Chinese statisticians were well aware that they had built a system that generated copious quantities of facts but left them poorly informed. For instance, although the State Statistics Bureau had detailed granular data for grain and cotton yields, once aggregated to provincial and national levels, these data were often found to be so inconsistent, especially across years, that statisticians and planners were unable to assess plan completion or the efficacy of specific policy measures. So desperate for change, Xiao and one of his deputies, a man by the name of Wang Sehua, began to consider options that had until then been anathema. In one of the earliest instances of scientific exchange among countries of the Global South, they reached out to statisticians at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. The director of the institute, a physicist by the name of P.C. Mahalanobis, and you can see him, he's the tall gentleman to the right of Joan Lai, sort of in the middle of the picture there. He had pioneered the use of large-scale random sampling. And as the Indian experience made clear, random sampling offered a cheaper, a more accurate, and a faster way to collect grassroots data. In the summer of 1957, Mahalanobis spent 3 weeks in Beijing. Chinese statisticians, including Wang Sehua, who actually you can see on the extreme right there, the person on the extreme right is Wang Sehua, and then to his right is Xiao. So Chinese statisticians, including Wang, visited Calcutta in 1957 and 1958. And back in Beijing, Xiao and Wang Sehua led efforts to prepare the grounds for a wider adoption of the large-scale random sampling method, hoping especially to employ it in the agricultural sector. The question of what would have happened had China adopted large-scale random sampling now occupies that murky realm that we call counterfactual history. In 1958, as many of you know, Mao and the party leadership initiated a new campaign declaring that China would surpass Britain's industrial production in 15 years. The Great Leap Forward, as the campaign was known, entailed a fundamental reorganization of labor and production technologies. In the world of data collection, it marked a turn away from exhaustive enumeration and the adoption instead of decentralized and ethnographic modes. Mao's 1927 report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan became the new methodological model for data collection. True knowledge could be gained only by a detailed in-person investigation, not through vast exhaustive surveys, nor through randomized sampling. The shift left the statistical apparatus with no reliable means to check its own data. Most tellingly, it contributed to the state's reduced capacity to ascertain accurately the devastating famine that overtook the countryside starting in 1959. It would take more than a decade until after the death of Mao's designated successor Lin Biao in 1971 to restore statistical work in China. And another decade still before the post-1978 policies of reform and opening up created the grounds for a thorough reappraisal of statistics and for the slow reintegration of probabilistic methods. So the story that I sketched out for you in brief of capacity building and socialist statistics and of exhaustive enumeration versus random sampling provides a useful window onto many related issues in early PRC history. And I'll conclude with some brief remarks about these. Among the questions on which this book offers fresh perspectives is the nature of the early PRC state. We get a sense of how PRC statisticians saw their own work and its limitations. And it helps us better understand the constraints under which planning had to operate. The system that the Chinese built was excellent at producing data. It actually incentivized the production of numbers. And numbers allow for decisions to be made. So it set in motion a vicious circle of data production and overproduction. At the same time, the system lacked any significant technology to check its own numbers. Taking the theory and practice of statistics seriously also helps to disentangle the ways in which data might appear to be manipulated or biased. There is a common perception today that China jukes the stats. Most analyses of this phenomenon in the popular press or in academic scholarship focus on what I label post hoc manipulation. That is, on the possibility and the degree to which a statistical datum, such as GDP today, gross value of industrial and agricultural output in 1950s China, was manipulated after it was generated in order to conform to some political compulsion. Such analyses are undoubtedly crucial, and scholars have explored contemporary institutional and structural issues in China's statistical work that might produce these kinds of inaccurate data. But in making it count, I highlight a different process that can also result in data being skewed in specific ways. This is a process that is about first principles and not post hoc manipulation. Chinese statisticians' initial assumptions about the nature of social reality generated path dependencies that constrained the types of methods they could use, and then in turn affected the data they collected and the analyses they performed. From a history of science and a history of data perspective, the case of statistics in 1950s PRC allows us to appreciate the variety of ways in which the enthusiasm for quantification manifested itself after 1945. In reformulating statistics explicitly as a social science, Chinese statisticians eschewed probabilistic methods and instead chose to valorize exhaustive enumeration and the seductive idea of total or comprehensive information that it promised. Socialist statistics was, for them, the perfect anti-capitalist antidote to the problem of accurate and correct knowledge production in the social world. China's transition to socialism after 1949 also has to be understood within a global context. But this context has to include not just Soviet aid and the tensions it generated, but also how the Chinese explored solutions in unexpected places. By identifying a clear instance of South-South scientific exchange between China and India, these findings thus force us to reassess our understanding of early Cold War scientific networks, which should no longer be dominated by center-periphery models, which usually take the USSR or the US at the center. Finally, a few words about our contemporary moment. From the vantage point of today, the travails of China's statisticians during the 1950s might appear quaint. Their obsession with definitional issues and the rejection of probabilistic methods, an artifact of a more ideologically driven time. I think that would be a mistake. The concerns that drove them are with us today. They are as alive and as urgent as they were 70 years ago. And at their heart is a set of basic and timeless questions. What do we need to know, and how should we know it? Their answers in the 1950s gave them confidence to value exhaustive enumeration above all else. Interestingly, this confidence has echoes in today's big data revolution, which similarly insists that the more information we quantify, the better shall our knowledge be, and the more appropriate our solutions. Much as in the 1950s, randomized sampling and in-depth case studies remain valuable but are increasingly neglected. Instead of ignoring them, we need to recognize that each method, the randomized, the ethnographic, and the exhaustive, offers unique insights. And together, they constitute a far more supple toolkit, expanding both what we can know and how we can know. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced the world to confront the uncertainty principle afresh. Much as mid-20th century Chinese statisticians discovered, the timely delivery of data and the guarantee of their accuracy sit in some tension with one another. To achieve precision in both remains as great a challenge today. And this affects two other values that we ought to cherish: transparency and commensurability. Timeliness and accuracy are of little use if we don't make the data freely available, and if we don't use commonly agreed standards. A lack of both transparency and commensurability hobbled statistical work in 1950s China, and they remain as intractable today, generating confusion that in its most vicious form can sow deep distrust between researchers, institutions, and communities. As we continue to confront biased and manipulated data in our daily lives, the example of 1950s China reminds us of the importance of separating outcomes that can be traced to first principles, such as statistics as a social science, from those that are a result of post hoc manipulation, such as, well, this estimate is too low, let's report a higher number. In a world increasingly divided by narrow nationalist visions, recognizing that all data are biased, but that they're not all biased in the same way, might well be the most important distinction of them all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnab, for a really fantastic presentation. We'll look forward to discussing it more and putting it in conversation with our other presentations in the Q&A. So next up, we have Gina and Tam. Gina, whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Okay, let's see. Let's see if I can get mine to work. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, and that's full screen now, we're good?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. All right, because I can't see you guys. So, first of all, thank you so much, Jack, for this invitation. 我非常感谢Jack 和政治大学的各位学生、各位教授、各位员工就邀请我参加这个会议我非常荣幸共享我的刚发表的这本书，而且我很欢迎你们的评论和问题。不好意思，我用英文做我的演讲，但是真的很欢迎你们的问题。Okay, so. All right, so my book begins with a question, right? What language represents the Chinese nation? This seemingly simple question theoretically has a very simple answer. Should be China's national language, right? 普通话, if we're talking about the People's Republic of China, right? I know where China gets confusing here, but we can say sort of the People's Republic. So 普通话 is the language the government officially recognizes as its national representative. It is what schools teach. It's what's privileged in media. It's taught to people like me in the United States as the titular Chinese language. Yet in some ways, 普通话 doesn't quite function like a language that represents the Chinese nation, mainly because there are a large number of people in the People's Republic of China who would be considered Chinese and don't actually speak it as their native language if they speak it at all. Instead, the native language of the majority of people in China, again, sort of like for a sizable minority is their only language, is what we would call a fangyan, right? Local languages, of which there are dozens of mutually intelligible ones. Here's a map here of various fangyan regions, but even this doesn't quite capture the linguistic diversity of Chinese languages, because within each of these sort of broader fangyan regions, there are more sort of mutually intelligible variants within those regions. Now, perhaps one of the reasons that these languages are often not thought of as representing the Chinese nation is because the government, academia, everyday people rarely call them or consider them languages at all. In English, the translation for fangyan is that's most common is the word dialect. Now, dialects by nature are dependent. They are subordinate. A dialect has to be a dialect of something, right? So even in this map here, right, we see Hanyu Fangyan, right? So these are dialects of Chinese, dialects of Hanyu. So thus, despite the fact that Cantonese and Shanghainese or Kejiuhua and Guoyu are as dissimilar and mutually unintelligible as, say, Spanish and Portuguese, which we often think of as languages, Fangyan are frequently referred to as variants of a Chinese language, whereas 普通话 is defined as the common language of the Chinese people. So 汉民族的共同语, or sometimes you'll hear also 全国的通用语. Now, at issue here isn't just the terms we use, right? So that we can get sort of nitty-gritty about the terms, but that's not really the issue here. Calling Putonghua a national standard and calling Fangyan variants implies that Putonghua can represent China in a way that Fangyan cannot. And this isn't just me saying this, it's really easy to find rhetoric that implies this hierarchical implication. So for instance, in a frequently used textbook, in the history of language in China, the author writes that it is Putonghua and Putonghua alone that allows the Chinese nation to develop and progress. So 促进国家的进步和文化的发展. News articles frequently feature quotes of school children reciting, "We are Chinese, we speak Putonghua, 我们是中国人，我们说普通话." Here, there's a sign at a sort of a school activity in Shanghai, and the little flyer this girl has is 推广普通话，共筑中国梦, right? So promulgate 普通话 and together build the China dream. So my simple question therefore presents us with a contradiction. On the one hand, Putonghua is loudly proclaimed as singularly and exclusively representing what it means to be Chinese. On the other hand, you have a nation of people who regularly speak other languages, languages that they often will very loudly proclaim are more Chinese than the national language. So given that we often draw a direct link between national languages and national identity and national sentiment, then how did nationalism even emerge in China at all? My answer is that Fangyan are central to understanding how Chinese national identity emerged and formed in China. In my book, I trace the history of this from the end of the Qing dynasty through the 1960s. And in this history, I find that the significance of Fangyan to Chinese nationalism and Chinese nation building can be detected in two interlocking narratives. Sorry, too early. On the one hand, there were those who argued that a Chinese identity needed to have a sole standard linguistic representative. For them, Fangyan were subsidiaries, they were non-standards, they were sometimes even obstacles to an idealized national identity. On the other hand, there were opposing groups who revered Fangyan, who praised Fangyan for having a history, having an emotional connection to the nation that was more authentic, real, and often long, right, than the Chinese national language. Fangyan for them were critical pieces of historic heritage in a way that Putonghua is not, and tools for expressing authentic emotions that Putonghua cannot. These narratives each tell their own story about Chinese nationalism as a whole. The former tells us how homogenization subsumes and discredits visions of the Chinese nation that ran counter to the standard. The latter emphasizes the persistence of a bottom-up declaration that national culture can be flexible and heterogeneous. When taken together, however, we see that these two narratives inform and shape one another, and in the process, collective identity as a whole. To put it this another way, I contend that these two narratives not only coexisted, but they were mutually co-constructive. They evolved and they shaped one another throughout the 20th century through to today, and that it is the interactions of these narratives, not one or the other, that best defines what it means to be Chinese in the 20th century. In this talk, I'd like to highlight a few snapshots from my book where we can see these two narratives, one promoting a homogeneous Chinese identity, the one promoting a more heterogeneous one, come into direct conflict with one another. My first snapshot will focus on arguments concerning the role of Fangyan in the construction of the Chinese national language during the national language movement. Moving from politics in the early Republican period to the academy, my second snapshot will look at the emergence of the intertwined fields of folk song studies and dialectology, 方言学, after the 1919 May 4th movement. I will then jump to the height of the Maoist period, exploring the effects of the 1958 Great Leap Forward on language reform. And then I'll end with talking a little bit about why I think this matters today. Okay, let's start in the year 1913. The Republic of China was barely 2 years old, and it was struggling to get its bearings. The Republic had replaced a 300-year-old dynasty, which had slowly crumbled in the face of domestic turmoil and multiple defeats in foreign wars. As revolutionaries turned state builders struggled to take a Chinese nation from dream to reality, they hotly debated what actually made a nation powerful. How do we make a nation? Right? On the topic of language, there was one thing that most of them agreed on, that the absence of a unified national language meant that the nation was vulnerable and could potentially collapse. The brand new Ministry of Education took this criticism seriously, and in February of 1913, they called on several dozen delegates to participate in a conference to to determine the standard pronunciation of a Chinese national language. I start with this meeting because as sort of someone who researches this topic, I get asked about it a lot. It's the source of a lot of myths. People from Guangzhou and Hong Kong in particular love to lament that they lost this conference's decision through a vote, that they lost the vote by a couple of votes, right? That oh, we were almost the national language and then we lost. But perhaps the most persistent part of this meeting's lore is that it was when Beijing so-called won the battle to be the national language. And there is some truths to these myths, right? These guys get together, they did get together. They did vote something similar, not on particular languages, I'll explain in a moment, but they did try to, sort of come to some sort of consensus. And eventually, though years later, Beijing's language would be chosen to serve as the basis of the national language. But the actual narrative of how Beijing won is really much more complex than this retelling suggests. Rather, the history of this conference shows that in the early years of the Republic of China, the country really wasn't asking which Fangyan do we pick of the many to be the national language. They were asking a very different question. They were asking, what does it mean for a language to represent a people and a nation? Now, few men in the late Qing articulated it better than this man, Zhang Bingling. Among the many reasons he is so famous, he is very, lots and lots of literature on him, but he popularized the idea that China's new nation had to be of and for ethnic Han Chinese people, not the Manchurian ruling class of China's Qing dynasty, who he saw as ethnically and really, quite frankly, racially inferior. One of the places he forcefully argued this was in this work here, Xin Fangyan. Published in 1907, this collection of articles searched for the origins of a unified Chinese language by tracing the etymology of several hundred regional phases back to before the Han Dynasty. But Zhang really had a political goal here, and that goal was to prove that all Fangyan had a shared core, that they were time capsules within which lay a unified Han Chinese past. Relatedly, he wanted to prove his contention that while all Fangyan had a connection to this shared core, some preserved that shared core better than others. This work directly informed Zhang's prescriptions for a Chinese national language. He believed it should be a newly constructed language that embodied the historical pith of the country's diverse Fangyan. Such a construction, of course, would need a base language upon which it would be built. Guided by his anti-Manchu politics, he fiercely opposed Beijing Fangyan as that base, argued that Northern Fangyan in general were no longer purely Chinese, and that they had been contaminated by centuries of contact with Northern non-Han groups. Instead, he suggested that the Chinese national language be based loosely off of the language spoken in the center of China, which he called the language of the states of Chu and Han, Chu Han Chu. Sometimes he would just say Chu, he would just focus on Chu. But in any case, this is sort of how he imagined this. Now, after 1911, proposals like Zhang seemed quite attuned to the needs of the new nation, as many saw the capital as too closely tied to the fallen Qing dynasty. His ideas attracted prominent supporters, including many members of that February 1913 conference. After a rather contentious meeting, supposedly they threw teacups at each other. I don't know if that's true, but there's reports that happened. They eventually came up with a language that was in some ways inspired by Zhang's ideas. It was a language that was 90% similar to the phonology of Beijing, so Zhang didn't love that, but it was still a constructed language, with the remaining 10 to 20% of its phonology comprised of phonological characteristics taken from other Fangyan. Most importantly, the ru sheng, which is not present in Putonghua. It's like the entering tone. It's the stop ending that you hear in southern Fangyan, like Cantonese, Fujianese, or Taiwanese. Now, I want to draw attention to this episode because it shows that many of the first constructors of the Chinese national language believed that no one particular Fangyan could represent the nation in its entirety. Rather, a language that at once represented the nation's present while also embodying its shared ethnic past had to be something that was reconstructed by these men themselves. And this is why Fangyan were so important, because these men's vision of a national standard was one that represented the diverse Han ethno-racial identity in its entirety. It had to account for all of China's Fangyan. Fangyan were not branches or subsidiary versions of a monolithic Chineseness. They were rather pieces of a puzzle, without which the full picture of the Chinese nation would remain incomplete. And so in 1913, we have our first Chinese national language. But after a few years, this language, seemingly born of compromise, began to make everybody angry. Those who had been tasked with the practical work of promulgating it began to realize that it had a lot of shortcomings, largely because they felt that enforcing a language that had no native speakers was not really feasible. And even those who were really on board with this bold experiment began to slowly doubt the practicality of this experiment. Take, for instance, this man, Zhao Yuanran, the father of Chinese linguistics. Zhao was a graduate of Cornell and Harvard, and he was really committed to this idea that a language could be constructed to embody the nation. And he actually made a recording of this language, this national language, in 1921 for the purposes of education. But within a couple of years, he started writing letters to his friends and family, quietly telling them that he thought that this just wasn't going to work, and that really the national language should just be Beijing Fangyan. This led him and others, several reformers, to sort of join together in 1925 and formally propose Beijing's language as the national standard. Zhao, when asked about this later in life, he was still kind of defensive about it, but ultimately he conceded that it wasn't going to work because, in his words, for 13 years, I was the sole speaker of this idiolect meant to be the national language for 600 million people. And so in 1925, the language of Beijing was made the national language, and this dream of this constructed national language faded away. Nonetheless, I tell this story to highlight that for a couple of decades, one of the most prominent visions of the Chinese national language was an invented one that encapsulated China's shared cultural core. And once reformers abandoned their idealized language in favor of simply making Beijing's language the national tongue, the unrealized dreams of these earlier ideas didn't just go away. These dreams reemerged in new contexts, repurposed to advance Fangyan as a more historic and cultural representative of the Chinese nation. And that happened very quickly. In 1919, 6 years after the first Chinese national language had been determined and 6 years before it would be replaced with the language of Beijing, the country erupted into cultural revolution. The May 4th movement, a series of protests against Japan's acquisition of Germany's colonies in China, dovetailed with ongoing calls from educated elites for the complete upheaval of China's core cultural institutions and intellectual frameworks. In the midst of this movement, academics inspired by the May 4th praise of scientific inquiry, real overlap with Arnab's talk, began to eagerly develop new university programs meant to create modern empirical knowledge about the country, its landscape, and its people. Two of these fields of study in particular, folk song studies and dialectology, were pivotal for reimagining the importance of Fangyan in China's national reinvention. Let's start with the folk song collection movement, first imagined by this man, Liu Banong. Born in Jiangsu, Liu discovered a passion for literature at an early age. Like a growing number of intellectuals in China's cities, Liu saw China's outdated language as emblematic of national backwardness and maintained that the country's best artistic expressions existed beyond elite written traditions. In particular, he extolled what he called low-grade fiction inspired by the everyday artistic productions of China's non-elites. Liu's enchantment with folk culture was matched by this man, Zhou Zuoren, who would eventually help Liu co-found the movement. Zhou traveled to Japan to study, where he translated Greek mythology, studied Japanese ghost stories, jotted down saucy jokes, and also wrote essays analyzing these tales and anecdotes using ethnographic theory from Europe and the United States. What brought these men together, one focused on low-grade literature, the other on ethnography, was that they both felt strongly that folk songs were critical to the making of a Chinese national culture. Their passions led them in 1922 to found a publication called Folk Songs Weekly, dedicated to collecting and publishing folk songs from across China. In its pages, they explained how folk songs checked all the boxes of a newly defined modern Chinese culture. Folk songs were vernacular, they were made for the masses, they violated the strict rules of elite poetry, but most importantly, they represented the authenticity of everyday life. They were, in a word, what Chinese people actually sounded like. And relevant to this lecture here, all of them were sung in a Fangyan. This had important implications for the meaning of Fangyan in China today. If folk songs were what the Chinese citizenry authentically sounded like, then Fangyan was the medium through which that authenticity was expressed. On the pages of Folk Songs Weekly, several contributors began to argue that Fangyan were so important that they needed to have their own discipline. But many of those dedicated to this discipline had a very specific image of what that discipline would look like. In particular, they thought it needed to be informed by the quantifiable methodologies of comparative linguistics. I'll let Professor of English from Beijing Daxue Lin Yutang explain. Oh, there we go. There should be no confusion as to the definition of Fangyan. The world's languages that have historical connection and became one system are called Yuyanxi. Language families are then divided into Yuyan, and within each language there are divisions of Fangyan. We ought to declare that when we speak of Fangyan today, we are using it with the meaning from modern linguistics. What Lin is saying here is that any study of Chinese Fangyan needed to graft onto the models prescribed by scholars of linguistics in Europe and the United States. And that meant that their methodologies needed to presume that Chinese languages related to one another, something like this. So this is a 19th century model from Germany, but I think it captures visually what Lin is thinking about here. And in particular, I want to highlight the fact that all dialects, these are English dialects, Netherlands dialects, Lithuanian dialects, right? They all stem from languages. So that meant that for Lin, the only proper way to study Fangyan was to treat them as variants of a larger language that actually evolve from those languages. Now, a research model to study Fangyan like this, like they're on this taxonomic tree, was first developed and executed by the aforementioned Zhao Yuanren. There he is. After working on China's language reform in the early 1920s, he published China's first full-length Fangyan survey titled Study on the Modern Wu Dialect in 1928. For his study, he asked representatives from 32 different localities in the area near Shanghai to pronounce a list of over 3,000 characters. He used a wax cylinder phonograph to record sounds, and in doing so, he isolated each character's initial, final, and tone. He then took all of that data and arranged them onto comparative charts that make my eyes hurt when I look at them, really dense, that juxtapose the relative pronunciation of each phoneme with the same phoneme in other surveyed areas. Now, Zhao fashioned himself a scientist, and he believed that any scientific methodology meant collecting quantifiable data sets, relying upon empirical observation, and using replicable methodologies. And Zhao's model here fit the bill. Since his phonological data was derived from an already existing set of characters, it was the same for everything, he could compare the phonology of several different Fangyan side by side. These charts created a unified field of comparison, whereby the distance among Fangyan could be measured based upon how many morphemes differed from one another and in what way. Yet in order to be a truly, so we can sort of look like a zoomed in here, here are his survey locations, these are the sample characters, he had them pronounced, and this is his data, right? Yet, in order to be a truly objective comparison, Zhao needed a constant to which to compare his data. He gave several points of reference, one of which I think is fascinating. It was this sort of like amalgamation. He called it an abstract phonological classification. He just took all of his data and sort of averaged it out to make a new invented phonological system. But he also used two existing systems. One of them was ancient phonetics, so guyin over here. And then the second one was Jin Guoyin, or the phonetics of the national language. Now, Zhao chose these constant, oops, sorry, went too far. There we go, okay. Now, Zhao chose these constants to both contextualize all of his data and to provide a reference point for his readers. But paired with the model of linguistic taxonomies, the use of constants had a hierarchical implication. Their use rested on the assumption that his surveyed Fangyan existed on a lower taxonomic plane, only made understandable through other reference languages like Guyin and Guoyin. And after 1930, the language that scholars used overwhelmingly most oftenly was the phonology of the national language. This included Zhao. Here is a survey that he did of Zhongshan dialect in 1939. You'll see that he compares it only to Guoyin. The second most common one was Guyin, was reconstructed ancient Chinese. With little explanation, therefore, Zhao and his colleagues made the phonology of the national language their constant. And this, I argued, has important consequences for understanding Fangyan today. The use of Guoyin, of national phonetics as a constant, perhaps unintentionally but nonetheless powerfully, helped to complete the notion that China's national language, which arguably is just at this point, another Fangyan like any other, had not just a unique political status, but a unique scientific status. In a methodology where all Fangyan are compared to the national phonology, it was granted the same status as linguistic root constants, thus occupying a higher rung on the taxonomic hierarchy. I bring up these two disciplines because they respectively saw Fangyan as embodying two unique qualities, authentic and subsidiary. For members of the folk song collection movement like Liu Banong and Zhou Zuoren, it was Fangyan's embodiment of authentic emotion that made them so valuable. For linguists like Zhao Yuanren, committed to forging a field of dialectology on a groundwork of scientific principles, Fangyan were a data that could be organized on hierarchical taxonomies that proved Fangyan's subordination to a Chinese language. And while it is difficult to know how much academic work actually matters to the general public, like I like my work, but I don't think it's gonna like change the world or anything, I argue that these understandings for Fangyan filtered down. They filtered down into everyday stories people told, entertainment, and most importantly, education. And that to me is made clear if we move ahead a couple of decades to the height of the Maoist period. After the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party wasted little time launching their new language policy. In November of that year, they launched an association of language reform, which worked to standardize pronunciation, script composition, and romanization. They outlined and announced this language reform retinue in the 1950s, including a scaffolded approach to simplifying Chinese characters, the romanization system, Hanyu Pinyin, and a standardized oral language called Putonghua, which they gave this official definition, Beijing's pronunciation as standard pronunciation, Northern dialect as base dialect, and modern vernacular literature as standard structure, vocabulary, and grammar. Now, there's a lot of continuity between these official PRC standards and language policies before 1949. Putonghua differs more from the national language of the Republic of China in its definition and marketing than its phonology. And despite the fact that the PRC's vision of a Chinese nation was one built and strengthened through Marxist-Leninist principles, there's this tension that we saw before 1949 of pushing for one national language as representative and celebrating linguistic diversity also characterized the early years of the People's Republic of China. Indeed, these narratives coexisted side by side for the first decade of the PRC. Though multiple arms of the CCP's bureaucracy worked really hard to promote and promulgate Putonghua as the nation's language. In particular, in the classroom, that was the focus. Official materials instructed new teachers to say that Putonghua was not meant to destroy Fangyan, right? That these were not mutually exclusive. At the same time, Fangyan were celebrated in other areas of life. One example of this was theater, where traveling drama troupes performed plays in local languages, supported and cheered on by the central state. But official tolerance for this coexistence changed in 1958. That year was the rollout of the Great Leap Forward, a sweeping economic policy meant to demonstrate the people's superhuman endeavors in economic production and cultural rejuvenation. The Great Leap Forward spirit was first and foremost applied to grain and steel production, with the central government calling on its citizens to double grain production or catch up with Britain in terms of steel. But the movement's rhetoric imbued almost all areas of life, including national language. For instance, a speech at a teaching Putonghua achievement exhibition, right? So 全国普通话教学成绩观摩会. At a speech, this was an annual event meant to showcase language promulgation. One of the speeches declared, there are those who believe when the Liberation Army is at our defense, can it be considered doing revolution, or to participate in the socialist movement, socialist education movement is to do revolution, or to say developing the Daqing oil fields is doing revolution. But as for promulgating Putonghua for the revolution, is that placing its value too high? Actually, in this age of our great revolution, whether it is a large-scale movement or everyday activities, it is all part of revolutionary work. To do educational work is to do revolution. To do cultural or cinematic work is to do revolution. To be a clerk, a service person, a ticket seller, a train attendant, or a radio broadcaster is all to do revolution. And then he ends his speech by saying, and so promulgating Putonghua is to do revolution, right? The Great Leap Forward rhetoric, in other words, equated speaking Putonghua with other nation-building efforts, like winning wars. What goes unstated, however, is that if speaking Putonghua facilitated revolution, then not speaking the national language essentially amounted to not supporting the revolution. The grand pronouncements and official rhetoric painted these issues in black and white: speak the national language and join the revolution, or don't. But if these policies were actually applied, like the rhetoric suggests, Putonghua would be really sort of universally and singularly spoken throughout China, which we know isn't true. In many rural areas of China, Putonghua can be rare, and in big cities like Guangzhou and Shanghai, the sounds on the streets are often a cacophony of multiple different Fangyan, Putonghua, English, and a code-switching mixture of all three. Sorry, my cat came to, he's really excited about dialect in China. Okay. These observable realities remind us that in the implementation of language reform nearly half a century ago, there was a significant gap between rhetoric and practice. So if we are to presume that the present can tell us something about the past, how do we explain this gap between rhetoric and reality? I think we can start, oh, sorry, I missed the slide. I think we can start by talking about where people actually spoke Fangyan, right? First of all, most people probably spoke it in the private home. Similarly, interviews I did with people growing up during this period confirmed that in their own classrooms, a lot of teachers just ignored official pronouncements. They found Putonghua too difficult to learn, or maybe they'd use it sometimes and not others. And finally, we should note that official rhetoric often presented as though there was Putonghua and Fangyan and nothing in between, and that's just not how languages work. Right? People might and did learn some Putonghua, learn it with a thick accent, like many of the PRC leaders, or even invent new languages altogether that meld Fangyan with Putonghua. I did some work in Qingdao, and linguists told me that most people there speak what they called Qingpu, which is the sort of like Qingdaoese Putonghua. Okay. So in other words, this Do Revolution rhetoric really was just rhetoric, but I don't think that makes it unimportant. Rather, by imbuing language reform with the vocabulary and spirit of mass political movements, the connotations of linguistic choices shifted. By directly tying language choices to political loyalty, this rhetoric unintentionally, or maybe intentionally, politicized language speaking as it related to national identity. And that brings us to today. To very briefly sum up this talk, I just want to talk a little bit about why I think this matters. Ultimately, my book argues at its core, languages are who we are. And in a world where Chinese nationalism drives everything from economic engagement to military decisions, it is worth considering two things. First, the belief that there is only one kind of Chinese nationalism just isn't true, right? There are people throughout China who seek to reclaim the meaning of Chinese identity to include diverse expressions, far more so than we often presume. In other words, a standardized symbol of homogeneous identity, a national language, a national song, a national dish. These are meaningful, but they're not the be-all and end-all of a national culture. Second, there are powerful forces in China that do imagine the Chinese nation as homogeneous. These homogenizing forces are often powerful, seeking to enforce and gatekeep one notion of what it means to be Chinese, including everything from citizenship, cultural practices, and political loyalty. To get a sense of just how high the stakes are and the tension between these two narratives, a good place to look and how I want to very, very briefly end my talk is Hong Kong. Since 1997, protests against Beijing's influence in the city are frequent, and each movement, it becomes progressively clear that Hong Kong's residents fear PRC encroachment in culture as much as political domination. Having had its own space to develop a Chinese identity on its own terms, the loss of that identity now feels threatened and imminent. Indeed, last year, there was a massive protest movement that emerged in opposition to an extradition bill between Hong Kong and China, which brought Taiwan in as well, and subsequently grew into a broader movement against the erosion of Hong Kong's economic, political, and cultural independence. In this quest to reclaim Chineseness from the homogenizing force of the PRC government, many Hong Kongers placed Cantonese, the language, at the heart of their identity. Few things show this better than a movie that came out a few years ago that became incredibly popular within the context of the protest movement. It's called 10 Years, 10年, and it's a series of 5 disconnected vignettes that explore a future Hong Kong under complete control of the Communist Party. Though the film mostly depicts really violent, state violence, national security laws, false flag operations, the third short film called Dialect traces the effects of a national language law in which everybody has to speak Putonghua. And this taxi driver here is marginalized for speaking Cantonese. Customers won't take his cab. He can't order an iced lemon tea. Even his wife insists that he can't speak to his son anymore in Cantonese. The looming loss, in other words, of Hong Kong's linguistic culture is portrayed as an end of the city's very identity, and linguistic loss is presented as a kind of violence that it may not be physical, but is nonetheless real. And this is the stakes of my book. In imagining how Chinese nationalism affects the world around us, it's important that we consider how homogenizing forces gain power to enforce one idea of what it means to be Chinese, who that hurts, what kind of violence that creates, while we also exhume the history of those voices who try to push back against those homogenizing forces. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina, for a truly fascinating and wonderful presentation. 因为我们现在休息10分钟左右吧，然后在10点半我们就会继续听常教授的演讲。Okay, 时间到了 David, whenever you're ready, please feel free to go ahead.
OK, 好，谢谢。各位大家好，首先非常感谢李默杰教授的邀请，然后也要感谢政治大学。今天这个演讲，我是关于我的新书这个The Hijacked War: The Story of Chinese POWs in the Korean War。但这本书呢，当然它的名称上本来我想要一个比较长的名字。所以未来的中文版我想把它翻译成被劫持的战争，中国人民志愿军战俘台湾与韩战。实际上这本书跟台湾有非常大的关系，而且特别的是跟政治大学有非常大的关系，因为这本书的开篇的第一个人物他就是，当然他不是政治大学，就是政治大学的对门，我相信在座的绝大多数人都认识这位老先生，待会我会讲到。今天的这本书上它其中有一部分是关于一部分内容是关于这个比较传统的政治史或者军事史、外交史，所以我想提出一个概念，所谓的2场韩战，或者说韩战理解成上半场、下半场。上半场呢是关于领土的战争，下半场呢是关于战俘的战争。我想这个可能学术界以前没人提到过。当然了，讲到这里的话，我还想问大家，或者说大家上也意识到，今年是韩战爆发70周年，但实际上很简单一个问题就是。所有的人没有人关心韩战，除了我自己之外，几乎是没有人关心的，我必须要承认这一点。当我们讲到这个韩战，我想简单的讲这几个国家的，我的演讲中会涉及到这些名称，比如中华人民共和国或者中共或 PRC， 然后台湾或者叫国民党政府或台湾，然后北韩或者韩国或者北韩有时候说是朝鲜，这4个地方。像我们讲到韩战的时候，跟台湾什么关系？很多人都会觉得没有太大关系，但实际上是有很大的关系的。我们换个方法，比如说针对美国或者中国和台湾，我们想问一个问题：哪个国家打赢了韩战呢？当然，很多美国人都会觉得，几乎没有美国人会认为自己打赢了韩战。但反过来说，那中华人民共和国呢？在中国大陆，他们很多人是觉得自己是打赢了韩战；在台湾，有多少人觉得台湾是韩战的最大的赢家？在台湾有很大一个说法，很常见的说法就是所谓的韩战救台湾。实际上从这一点上来说呢，台湾是这个韩战中的一个胜利者。但实际上在美国来说，一般人会认为韩战是打成一个平局 ，it was a tie。所以奥巴马总统在2013年他专门有个演讲，他说韩战不是打了个平局，实际上是一个胜利。为什么呢？因为韩战至少说拯救了韩国。如果说这就是韩战的目的的话，但实际上这场战争在韩战的第1年就已经实现了，但是韩战为什么又打了2年？而且如果韩战是个胜利的话，对美国来说，为什么在美国它成为一场被遗忘的战争？所以要理解回答这个问题上很简单，所以我们把它理解成韩战2场战争，或上半场、下半场，这样就很容易理解为什么它成为一个被遗忘的战争。因为韩战上第1年这个领土的战争上进行了1年，然后到了1951年的7月10号就开始了停战谈判，延续了整整2年，但最后有什么结局呢？领土上的变化上到了第1年就已经 我们今天看到的边界和当初战争爆发时的边界上有非常小的变动，是以战争到了第1年停战谈判开始的时候呢，这个领土的战争实际上就已经结束了，但是为什么还打了2年？而且关于领土的谈判，停战谈判刚进行了4个月，双方就已经签订了协议，就已经同意沿着这个实际控制线，也就是实际离开战时候的38线是差不多的地方，就已经同意，然后又打了2年，这领土几乎是没有什么变化的。那为什么呢？实际上就是为了战俘。在美国的大众文化里面有很多的电影，有几部电影，50年代初就有一部电影叫做 Powerful， 它其中一个演员非常有名的一个演员是谁呢？就是雷根总统。但这个电影的一个主题就是什么 ？Brainwashing in action， 就关于中共对美国战俘进行，或者苏联人对美国战俘进行洗脑。然后到了5、6年又有这部新的电影叫做 Manchurian Candidate， 就是特别是关于洗脑的一个故事，就讲到中国人怎么对这些美国人进行洗脑，美国战俘进行洗脑。所以当年美国人韩战结束后对中共的一个指控就是就是中国人对美国人进行洗脑。但是中共对美国人洗脑有什么成果呢？实际上我们可以看到，美国差不多有7000多战俘被中共俘虏，最后也只有21个人洗脑成功，他们选择去中国。所以有一部纪录片叫做 They Chose China， 大家有空的时候可以看一下，非常有意思。但最后呢，反过来说，那有多少中国战俘拒绝去回中国大陆？那有2/3，14000多人选择不回大陆，要求不回大陆，他们最后来到了台湾。所以说我们可以问一个问题，是不是美国人也对中国人进行洗脑？所以说这些中国战俘他们拒绝回大陆，他们要变成了反共的战俘，他们要来台湾成为反共义士呢？有没有呢？实际上美国人也对这些战俘，北韩和中国战俘进行洗脑。这句话不是我说的，谁说呢？ General Bradley， 当时的参谋长联席会议的主席，当时的5星上将，他在自己的回忆录中有这样一句话，他说这个国安会文件81号1，他们的一个决议的内容就是要对北韩战俘进行洗脑。那后来这个洗脑呢又扩大到了中国战俘身上，所以造成了很严重的后果。所以说如果战俘是一个这个朝鲜战争是一场胜利的话，为什么在美国变成了被遗忘的战争？所以我提出一个解释，就是因为韩战为了那些反共的战俘，就是那些反共义士多打了1年半，美国付出了巨大的牺牲，巨大的代价，这并不是美国人预料的，这不是一场阴谋。当然美国人政府不希望美国人民意识到这一点，所以在美国它就成为一场被遗忘的战争。当然具体的很多的过程我在书中会讲到，今天咱们有机会去仔细讲。同样的对台湾来说，那这个韩战对台湾什么关系？韩战反共义士或者战俘对台湾什么关系？今天几乎是没有人记得。当然有时候看报道大家可能会知道1、2、3日有自由日，但是到底是怎么回事有人知道吗？这很少人知道，或者很少人关心。除了1、2、3自由日这个名称之外，到底韩战是怎么回事是没人知道的，很少人知道的。或者另外一个问题，来到台湾14000多个反共的战俘，你知道有任何一位写过回忆录在台湾发表吗？出版吗？没有，只有一位了。他的高文俊，他也是去了美国，后来之后回到台湾自费出版的。但是14000人居然没有任何一个人在台湾留在台湾的战俘出版一本关于他们的回忆录，一个都没有。这是为什么？很有趣的一个现象。在中国大陆，当然过去的10月份正好是中共高调的纪念这个韩战爆发的抗美援朝70周年，拍了3个系列纪录片 ，CCTV 中央电视台有个6集的《为了和平》，里面一个字也没提到战俘，然后另外一个6集《英雄儿女》，一个字没提到战俘，然后这个20集的纪录片，其中有1集是专门讲战俘的，但它的核心是讲那些21个选择去中国大陆的战俘，其中只有几句话提到了被美军或者被联合国军俘虏的21000、22000个中国战俘，也没有提到有14000多个中国战俘来到了台湾，完全没有提到。所以中共虽然一方面是高调的纪念，但实际上另外一方面也是抹去了这个记忆。真正韩战的后半段是为什么？战争多达2年是为什么？就是为了战俘，他不想让中国人民知道。所以台湾大陆还有美国，实际上他们都是这种 沉默的合谋者，把这战争的真相或者它的实质的争议，后半段的实质的争议，把它给抹去了。为什么呢？我们来简单的看一下。所以战争实际上是有两半，像一般呢，在大陆它会纪念这个战争，但是也只是纪念上半场领土之战，后半场呢，实际上他不想让人民知道，实际上是为了战俘而战。像这里面有这个说的比较从政策的层面有一个 argument， 就是这个战争可以理解成上半场、下半场。这个结果并不是美国人的阴谋，也不是和台湾和蒋介石的合谋，所以它是一个对美国人说是个意外的结局，他没有想到的，因为他采取了两项政策，一个是对战俘进行这个洗脑的宣传，另外一个是给战俘自由的选择。他没有想到有这么多的人会选择或表示不愿意回大陆，所以造成这样的结果，这是美国人没有想到的。所以美国政府要想让人民忘记这场战争。然后他被谁劫持呢？当然就是被反共的战俘，还有就是台湾的蒋介石或者国民党政府。所以这个战争的后半段是完全是关于为了这些反共的战俘而战，这是美国人完全没有想到的，所以他们后来不想让人民记得。这场战争从这个时间表上可以很明显的看出，真正的正好是中间的一半。停战谈判刚开始4个月就达成关于领土的协议，但是战争后来又进行了1年半时间，就完全是关于领土。最后的代价是什么呢？这是非常大的代价，我们等一下看一下。就是战争的上半段解决了领土问题，下半段关于这个战俘，最后结局是什么？看不出任何别的结局，就是有14000个中国战俘来到了台湾。当时台湾政府也派人去板门店把他们给接运回来。当然也有7000多个北韩的战俘选择或者坚持留在了韩国，但这部分并不是核心的争议，我书中会有仔细的解释这个问题。所以123自由日当然什么说是123，实际上是1月20号的21号，他们就开始离开韩国，就前往前来台湾，就到总统府台北有很盛大的欢迎的仪式。最后结局就是1/3的战俘7110人回到大陆，然后来到台湾的是14000多人。最后还有12个中国战俘选择要求去中立国，最后他们是先去到了印度，后来又去了阿根廷和巴西。那代价是什么呢？这战争我们可以看到，在这战争的后半段后2年，就是边打边谈的2年，美军牺牲的人数是12000人。然后你看最后来到台湾的战俘多少人？14000人。所以说基本上你可以说是可以这样理解，为了一个中国战俘来台湾的自由，就有1个美国大兵就此而牺牲。或者反过来说，为了阻止一个中国战俘来台湾，就有10个朝鲜人被轰炸死。或者为了阻止一个中国战俘来台湾，差不多有9个中国的士兵牺牲掉。但最关键的是这一点，美国人真的愿意牺牲一个人，为了给这些战俘来台湾的自由吗？如果美国人大兵的母亲知道这个事实，他会怎么想？看这句话是美国一个大兵的母亲写信给给白宫，他就说，这韩战最后的后半段变成了一个 exchange of Chinese lives for American lives， 拿美国人的命来换中国人命，这样更准确的说是拿美国人的命来换中国人去台湾的自由，是这样吗？美国人真的愿意这样做吗？当然，如果美国人民意识到这一点的话，他们肯定不会再支持韩战。所以美国政府不希望人民意识到中间这个对等的关系。所以这场战争被谁劫持呢？就被中国籍的反共战俘和蒋介石台湾政府。当然他们怎么做得到这一点，这很难想象，一些战俘怎么可能劫持一场战争？因为美国人给2项政策给战俘洗脑和自愿遣返，但是这是其结果是美国人完全没有意料到的。所以战俘营里他们就发生了这一系列的这个冲突，反共战俘和亲共战俘几乎就是一个中国内战的延续。所以我今天呢，这是我书的一个主旨，然后书中呢也有很多人的故事，通过这些人的故事的展现，他们在这不同战争中的一些抉择。所以今天我想讲3个人的故事，来通过这些人的故事来讲他们 在战俘营或甚至在之前的内战中，他们做出的不同的选择和造成的不同的后果。今天我们想想，第一个，这位老先生，如果大家看到这里的话，很多人可能会认识他，特别是在政大的人可能会认识他。今天呢，我就想放一个短的 video 就可以讲这个他的故事。我先停一下，我换一个 video， 大家听得见吗 ？OK， 我看我换一个。OK， 这是我 OK， 大家看，如果政大的同学可能一看就认识他，政大的同学90%都认识这位先生。这是5年前拍的一个片子。当时他是93岁哦，现在已经99岁了。
还有10公里，还有10公里啊！
刚才指标啊，还有10公里。
这老先生的四川人，所以他1941年、42年的时候，他考入了他进入到这个黄埔军校，也是陆军官校，但他没有毕业啊。这大概是当年他在的时候，西方的通讯社拍摄的一些片子。
It is seldom that we are afforded an opportunity to picture affairs in China, but the arrival of these films from Chengdu is the signal for us again to salute the fourth big partner of the United Nations.
所以他离开军校之后呢，他参加了远征军，然后是远征军这个炮兵少尉。他参加了这个重要的密支那战役啊。这是密支那的机场，这是当年的这个滑翔机。然后我们可以看到史迪威将军啊，当时的这个中缅印战区的参谋长。那因为我们在档案馆里，美国国家档案馆找到他的档案，所以可以看到当年他的对不起，我访问他的时候，他讲的这些口述的内容，当年他在韩战的时候，他向美军投诚之后，他讲述的当年的这些记录上是完全对应得上的。比如说他参加这个，他进入这个陆军官校 Central Military Academy， 然后青年远征军，所以这系列的都是完全对得上的，这是非常幸运的，我们可以访问到他本人，也可以找到他的资料。然后抗战结束前，他又转到了这个伞兵部队，成为了一个伞兵少尉。但这张照片并不是他本人呢，这是当年的伞兵部队。然后抗战的这个韩战期间呢，他又成为了这个志愿军的卡车司机，就在战俘营，他成为了一个反共的领袖。OK， 好，我们再回来。对不起，这个用起来很麻烦了，我看不见，我看不见任何人。OK， 好，所以具体的上他做了很多的事情，我简单的讲一下啊。 他是这个伞兵部队的，然后他到了韩战的时候呢，因为他韩战战场等于他是叛逃的，他投诚到这个美军联军这边是在开城，然后他说他是个卡车司机，然后美军过来之后呢，美军又征用他做这种间谍或者情报人员，把他空投到北韩，让他走路又走回来。结果呢，他去过他空投过1次还是2次，他都活着回来，所以这是非常罕见的。然后再讲第二个 case， 第二个人呢是张则仕，当然他是一个清华大学的学生，然后成为了这个共产党地下党，然后后来他又到了韩战，他在战俘营，他就是个坚决要求回中国大陆的一个亲共的战俘。他上的学校呢是一个美国人，在 Oberlin College 在中国办的一个学校，所以他本来是一个基督徒，一个比较亲近美国的人，但是他在上清华大学的时候，他就很快因为沈崇事件一系列原因，他就变成了一个共产党。然后到了韩战的时候，他就加入了，当然他已经是共军的一个军官，然后他就到了朝鲜战场，在战俘营呢，他坚决要求回大陆。然后第三个 case， 这个人就是选择去中立国，然后经过了印度，然后到了阿根廷的一个12个中国人之一。他在历史上很多记录都会讲得非常清楚，他是一个反共的战俘。比如这本书是蒋中正、蒋介石书写的书名《反共义士奋斗史》，里面都有记录他是个反共战俘。但是为什么他会去阿根廷呢？他不如来台湾。所以我2014年在阿根廷去找到他，去访问他的时候，我说你讲一下你的历史，他说我不想讲，他说过去历史太痛苦了。所以当时我非常失望，我说跑这么远，你说不讲，我不是白来了吗？不过没有关系，幸好我们有他的档案，所以他的历史我们都可以对应得上的。所以这是美军的审讯记录，在1951年他有讲述他的简历，所以我们可以查其他的资料是完全对得上的。他出生在贵州的思南，就是贵州的一个地方，非常漂亮的地方，但是可以想象也是非常穷的。但他家是个地主，所以他能够去上这个重庆的中央警官大学。但他刚刚毕业的时候，正好是1949年，所以国民党政府已经快垮掉了，所以他回到家乡当了警察，但没几天中共就来了。所以有记录讲他是参加了当地的这个游击队，反共游击队。但我问他的时候，他说当然我没有，他说我就直接参加了解放军。他怎么回事呢？可能吗？但实际上是完全可能的，因为他的讲的这个时间呢，和当年在韩战刚爆发时候，中共开始了这个镇压反革命的运动，毛泽东说要大杀一批，他给出一个目标，要杀掉1/1000的人口，在某些地方可以杀1000个人，可以杀2到3个人。所以当年特别是在大西南、四川、云南、贵州参加过这些反共游击队的造反，这些人都被当作土匪来剿灭，所以很多人被捕，很多人被枪决。所以他实际上是根据他当年的审讯记录，他讲他是参加过反共游击队，但现在当然不承认了。但实际上即使这些被抓的这些土匪，很多人当然不会被杀掉的，但是呢，这匪首会被杀掉。但是很多人即使投降了，还是很危险。譬如说，这有一个档案，不是他的档案，这是类似的一个人，贵州的赤水的一个人，他参加反共游击队被俘，然后他也自新悔过，但结果呢，中共还是决定把他给处决。他是非常可能被处决，为什么？他曾经做过国军的这位陈立人先生做过国军的，他是国民党的警察，所以说是一个重点的打击的对象。所以他就选择去参军。他讲他1950年11月14号参军，有这么准确的一个日子，可能吗？实际上是完全可能的。我们看到档案里，10月7号邓小平给毛泽东说，他要送3个军的兵力从大西南送到朝鲜，正好14号1个礼拜之内呢，他就把这3个军的军队给集合起来。所以在贵州这个部队，他们马上就开始集中离开贵州去重庆，准备去朝鲜。所以在路上他们是吸收了一些当地的新兵，所以他是非常可能就是在这个礼拜之内，他加入了解放军，然后马上这支部队正好就要去朝鲜，所以他顺利的到了朝鲜。到了朝鲜战场上呢，在战场上他就开小差躲在山里，然后最后就投诚到了联军这一边。他投诚的地方呢，大概是在这个区域，今天的朝鲜，也是离3·8线非常近的一个区域。所以在1951年的6月份，就是非常多的战俘被俘虏。 所以这段时间有15000多个战俘，最大多数的人是在这个朝鲜中部的这个春川附近这个山头里，至少有7、8千人被俘虏，其中一个就包括这位张则仕先生，他是亲共的，当然，但他们这个部队都在这里被俘虏。这是后来我和他一起去当地去实地去看这个地点的时候，他说，对，这就像我们当年被俘虏的地方。然后在战俘营成为了一个反共的一个坚定的亲共的战俘。结果呢，后来他因为参与到一些大型的事件中，就被美军把他给关起来，作为一个战犯，所以他也拍了这张很特别的照片。看看这几个反共的这个亲共战俘的领袖都被关在这个最高监狱里面 ，maximum security prison， 他们关在这样的监狱里面。这是美国档案馆里的照片。然后他讲的故事呢，他的自传里讲的，和他后来我们可以找到在档案馆里有他当年写过的一些信、一些抗议书，我们都可以看到，实际上都可以对应得上张则仕就在这里。后来到了1953年，他才回到中国。后来我们在想，为什么虽然有这么多人坚定的要求回国，为什么更多的人选择去台湾或者拒绝回国呢？我看战俘营内的一些情况，大部分的战俘是被关在这个韩国的聚集岛，当时这个岛上关了15万名战俘，其中有2万是中国人。这个战俘营是非常巨大的，但里面呢，美国人在这里搞一个反共的宣传，就像这个 Bradley 讲的，要 brainwash North Korea， 后来也包括中国人，所以他们战俘营搞各种反共的活动，他们用共产党方法来控制共产党，就搞各种的唱歌、演戏，但是都是必须要参与的，强制参与的。然后呢，他们也有国民党的方法，就用刺字的方法，所以有的老师可能见过一些反共义士胳膊上刺字，开始是自愿的，后来就变成了是强迫的。所以这美国人他们的外交官也有观察，这实际上是后来刺字很多人是被胁迫的，是没有选择的。比如这位回到大陆的，因为他要回去，结果他手上的字就被反共战俘给割下来，所以留下很大一个伤疤。所以最后1952年5月份，联合国军对这些战俘进行调查，问他们愿不愿意回国。结果呢，有超过三分之二的中国战俘表示他们拒绝回去。但是这个 interview， 这个 poll， 这个所谓的甄别，表面上看上是自由的，但实际上关键不是在这个甄别的现场，而是在前一天晚上发生什么事情。前一天晚上有10几个人就被杀死了，就是反共战俘把这亲共战俘给杀死。我们也看到一些档案可以清楚的证明，在这个事件的前夜是发生了很多暴力的事件，所以第二天很多战俘是非常的恐惧，所以他们害怕联合国军是骗他们的，所以他们不敢说要回中国去。比如说这有一个大学生就被现场给打死，所以他的尸检报告说得很清楚，他身上有刀伤，然后他的胳膊上的刺字是皮肤是被割下来的。结果就有14000多人当时就表示坚决不愿意回大陆，所以到1952年的时候，就4月份、5月份就已经非常清楚，就有14000多人，他们是要求去台湾的。结果呢，又过了1年多，他们才来到台湾，所以这个结局在1952年就已经决定下来了。那当时一个反共的领袖就是这位后来去中立国的先生，这个陈立人先生，但是这亲共的战俘对他描述说，他实际上不是很暴力的，他的要和善一些，花样要多一些。这些亲共战俘都这么描述他，或者说他比较聪明，不是用暴力的方法，他是用共产的方法来治共产党。然后他们在济州岛的时候，但是这位先生他和另外一个反共战俘，他们都是反共领袖，结果发生了冲突，也就是为了争功了，争这个地位，结果他们反共战俘之间也是非常暴力的，结果他被这个人打了。这个事件呢，是有不少人我访问的人，他们都有证实这个事件。我访问过3个人，他们都是现场看到他被殴打，被另外一个派系的人殴打。他被打了之后呢，他这个殴打的现场就像中共的这种公审的现场，所以他是开群众大会来斗争他们。所以他受伤之后，他被打了受伤，然后美军的记录也讲得非常清楚，但没有说他的名字，但应该是对得上的。他说有33个人被这场斗争中被打，其中3个人后来死在了医院里面。所以另外一本书里的美军当年的访问也讲到，当时他们发生了很严重的斗争，然后这时候呢，他就决定 不来台湾，他就想去中立国。所以他后来到了什么时候他有机会呢？到了停战之后，这个联合国军中立国遣返委员会把这些战俘又送回了板门店，然后进行了3个月的所谓的解释，让中共派人来游说他们回大陆，结果大部分人都不愿意所以这是当时这个所谓的解释的现场。有少数人是回到了大陆，只有400多人。当时看印度的军队来负责看管他们，说印度人是尽力的做到很公允，但是呢，这个战俘营实际上是已经被反共战俘控制了，所以他们是很难逃出来的。这位先生呢，他们不想回大陆，他也不想去台湾，他怎么办呢？他也需要翻越铁丝网，他要求印度人带他去中立国，就他坐船。最后1952年的2月9号，他和另外11个中国人、11个中国人，还有76个朝鲜人，他们一起去到了印度。到印度之后呢，然后受到了很好的接待。这个总理尼赫鲁还亲自来接见他们。但是他们当时印度还是比较穷，怎么想去中立国？他们想去什么瑞士、瑞典，当然是去不了的。最后呢，又待了2年，有2个国家愿意接收他们，一个是阿根廷，一个是巴西。最后他就去到了阿根廷。1956年的时候，他在阿根廷的时候，他非常成功，成为了一个成功的商人。然后他也娶了当地的一个太太，然后他后来成为一个很大的珠宝商，所以后来和这些总统他们都是非常亲近的。在70年代、80年代，就是2014年的时候，当地的报纸对他的一个报道 ，Super Chino 超级中国人。这时候他已经快85岁了，已经85岁了。所以他最后他是从中共那边逃出来，从反共分子那里逃出来，实际上他也从美国人手里逃出来因为还有很多其他像类似的战俘被美国人征用去做间谍，结果后来大部分人都被中共抓住，被杀掉了。所以最后的时候，我们想一想，到底这14000多个人里面有多少人是真正的铁杆的反共呢？大概是3000人。所以说，实际上我们可以想象，21000、22000人中有3000人是坚决反共的。就是说，在早期的中华人民共和国，有7个里面就有1个人坚决想逃出来。那肯定说，中华人民共和国的早期不是一个传统学术说的所谓的 honeymoon period 这个蜜月期，这是不存在的。那有更多的人，他们想逃，结果没有逃出来，结果都死在了中国大陆。这些很少数的幸运的人逃出来了。但美国的政策呢，实际上是很有问题的。当然，今天很多人都会说，这是一个简单的什么自由民主和共产主义的斗争，实际上是比较复杂很多的。像美国人他采取这个政策上，他的人道立场也是大打折扣的，因为他执行这个反共洗脑加上支援遣返的政策，他的后果是他没有想到的。战争多打1年半，造成巨大而无谓的牺牲，也没有实现任何的政治军事目标。但他人道立场也很成问题，因为他剥夺了那些想回大陆战俘的人权。他的确保护了那些想来台湾的战俘的人权，大约3000人。但实际上呢，但反过来呢，其中最坚定反共的和一些很多军校的学生200-300人，他们却又被美军秘密的征用，让他们去空投到北韩去刺探情报，结果大部分人都牺牲掉了，或者被抓住送回大陆。所以说这个事情是非常的复杂，美国人的人道立场也是大打折扣的。但他为什么会有这样的政策？实际上这美国政府政策上是很失败的，所以他今天不愿意提这件事情。相似的美国对华政策的失败也是同样的根源。第一，他们是对中国和对中国人的轻视；第二呢，是对中共的无知。当然这2点实际上是相关的，因为他们对中国人的轻视，所以他们对中共的无知。他们不了解他们这政策会对中国战俘有什么样的后果，所以对他们进行洗脑的宣传上是毫无意义、毫无价值，只会让这些中国战俘身处危险的。所以他们坚决的不愿意回大陆，就是因为美国政府的政策把他们放入了置于这样的一个困境之中。然后最后我想大家可能很关心这些人，这3个人，当然很多的人在这书里，但是今天我只讲这3个人。这位老先生他还健在，在座的同学也许你会看到他，有的时候也许这个四川饭馆吃饭的时候，这是2015年的时候我第一次访问他时候拍的照片。这是5个月前，今年夏天的时候，你可以看出来他根本没有变，只是我变老了，他没有变老，他已经99岁了。然后这位张泽石先生呢，这是他当年在战俘营，你可以看他的眼睛是非常非常有神的，很多的愤怒， 那你看，这是最近一个朋友去北京的时候拍的，我们想给大家放一下，这一个很短的片子。你可以看到他的眼睛是不是还是一样的？这过去了70年。哎，等一下啊。所以我这本书呢，我写的时候，让我把它献给这些2万2000中国战俘，无论他们是选择回到中国大陆，回到来台湾，或者选择中立国，还有那些几百个死在了战俘营的战俘，还有那些因为去执行这些美军的秘密任务而牺牲在38线以北的这些战俘。好，我讲到这里，谢谢大家，欢迎大家的问题。OK，
非常感谢常教授非常丰富、非常有意思的演讲。那么我们剩下的时间呢，都要留给综合的讨论和问答。我们先要邀请政治大学历史系的蓝世奇教授跟我们分享一下他的一些 comments 和提问。好 ，Mike, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jack. What an intellectual feast. Thank you, David, Gina, and Arna. Although we couldn't meet in person, but I feel that we have stimulated so much ideas and learned so much and got so inspired from all the presentation by the three of you. 真的非常高兴有机会可以听到在近代中国历史研究上面最新的成果，特别是从3位这么年轻又有活力的学者们，我觉得真的非常的高兴，因为我们很清楚的可以看到，在对中国研究的几个课题上面，3位学者都不约而同的从一个比较 transnational 跨国的这个脉络之下来讨论，包括刚刚David 提到的中国、美国、台湾，Gina 提到的其实也是应该说Arna 提到的这个，不管是印度对中国的影响，或者是这个其他西方国家对中国在统计上面的影响，我觉得很清楚，我们都可以看得到这样有一个跨国的脉络。那也因为这样子，所以我刚刚在这个 chat box 里面已经很不好意思的加了很多自己的想法在里面，所以各位如果有兴趣的话，就有空的时候看一下。那特别是 Gina 提到的这个跟方言语言有关系的问题，就让我马上想到了之前我自己有机会在新加坡待了一段时间，所以在新加坡就看到很有趣的例子。我一直在思考一个问题，就是100多年前，孙中山到南洋，就是到新加坡这些地方去募款，为了他自己的革命运动，在这个共和国还没有成立之前，在革命还没有成功之前，他遇到了很多人，比如说我刚刚提到的几位，在这个 chat box 里面提到了，他遇到了这个在新加坡的一些同志，张永福、陈楚南、林义顺这些人。可是很有趣的，这些人跟孙中山会不会其实是不同的语言？孙中山应该是讲广东话的，他的北京话怎么样我不敢说，可是我有听过他的录音，完全听不懂。我想应该没错。那张永福是福建人，讲闽南话的；陈楚南是潮州人，林义顺好像也是，如果没有记错的话，应该也是个潮州人。所以我觉得在海外华人的这个环境当中，我现在就是试着把 Gina 的这个研究也用一个比较跨国的脉络来思考。就在海外华人的脉络当中，有一个很有趣的现象，就是在中国可能讲不同方言的人比较没有那么多机会彼此在一起，因为方言群其实是一个有这个地理分布 geographical divide。那在海外不同方言群的人会遇到，那在这个时间点，他们又共同在思考什么叫中国，什么叫中国人。 可是是用不同的语言来思考或是沟通。所以我觉得这是一个非常有趣的一个延伸出来的课题。很抱歉，我并没有说特别有什么看法，或者是也不能算是要跟 Gina 提问，只是说我觉得这是一个很有趣的概念。那我觉得刚刚我自己感觉到三位的研究，其实包括 David 在谈这个中华人民共和国一直在跟美国这个为了战俘的问题在对抗，或者在协商。那 Gina 提到的这个语言怎么样作为一个好像能够让中国有强大的民族认同、国家认同很重要的一个媒介。那 Aruna 提到的这个，其实我讲中华人民共和国会这么努力的要来统计调查自己国家的状况，其实我觉得三位谈到的问题都是特别呼应今天我们已经很熟悉的这个中国怎么样希望能够让自己变成一个强国，或者是说中国的政治人物、知识分子都共同的在思考如何让中国。这个讲起来有点像这个 President Trump 在讲的 To make America great， 不过他是说 again。我觉得中国其实在过去的100年来，大概应该都是在 How to make China great。那我觉得刚刚几位的这个研究其实都扣紧了这个课题。那我一开始会想到有提了几点，就是在那个 chat box 里面提到的，可能如果我们放在东亚的脉络里面来看的话，其实100年前有另外一个国家也在很努力的思考，或者是在努力 how to make Japan great。那后来的发展是我们都知道，就是从19世纪末到20世纪中这段时间，的确日本作为一个帝国越来越强大，可是在后来的后果，不好意思，我现在只是这个就是突发奇想的想到了一些关联性。我当然不是在 imply 说中国接下来会有什么样的情况。我觉得有趣的就是，我觉得在我们共同努力，应该说我们在研究不同的国家在不同的时间脉络之下如何让自己的国家强大，其实可以看到一些对照。那这些对照背后，其实我特别喜欢 Aruna 谈到的这个统计调查的数字，其实背后都是有意识形态跟政治的目的，也让我们重新思考看起来非常中立的知识，可能它背后有很强的权力运作的结果。那我觉得 Gina 谈到的这个语言更是非常清楚的，要选什么语言，如何对待方言。我觉得这个权力在背后会产生的影响，可能是我们在面对所有的知识生产跟知识生产的结果的时候都可以思考的问题。不好意思，我不要占太多的时间。我刚刚只是因为实在是想到太多的东西了，所以很兴奋的想要这个把自己很不成熟的想法提出来跟大家思考。但我觉得特别，我们今天的主题叫做这个 Modern China in Global Context， 所以我刚刚提到的，不管是跟东南亚、新加坡华人有关系的，或者是刚刚提到的比较从历史的纵深来看，在100年前东亚国家日本产生的一些变化，还有对东亚带来的影响，我觉得不管从横向空间上来看，或者是从纵向从历史的这个时间上来看，我觉得三位的研究都可以给我们带来很大的启发。那我相信今天有很多的这个学者朋友们来参加我们今天的这个讨论。其实大家不管是对中国史有兴趣，还是对东亚的历史有兴趣，或者是对更广大其他地方的世界的历史有兴趣，我觉得其实三位都提供了很好的分析跟思考的切入点，可以让我们对自己的研究，我自己现在做比较多是做台湾史的，可是我觉得不管Aruna 提到这个调查，或者是 Gina 提到的方言的问题，或者是 David 提到的这个权力，然后怎么样影响了这个战争的变化，战争的进程，其实我都一直想到在台湾史里面有很多可以再探讨的问题，所以 特别是今天在座我知道今天来参加很多是研究生，所以研究生们你们有很多新的题目可以做，所以也希望大家可以这个真的好好的也找机会研读这三位学者最新的研究成果。我就先讲到这里，谢谢。
非常感谢蓝教授的 comments。然后我们先给我们的三位演讲者一个机会，先回复一下蓝教授的 comments， 然后观众的各位就可以提问题。我们有2种提问题的方式，可以用 chat 的功能写您的问题，或者可以举手问问题好的，那谁要先开始呢？
我可以先说一下
好的。
谢谢蓝教授，就是你的很精彩和是给我很多思考的一些方面的一些评论，真的很感谢你。其实我常常在想到这个问题因为就是50年以前或者以前的中国或者海外的，有很多人说不一样的方言，他们是怎么沟通？还有钱选同他常常提到这个问题，他说其实真正的普通话不是现在的普通话，但是他说一个真的普通话，一个 common language， 就是老百姓他们在一起，他们说不一样的方言，他们是怎么沟通？他们就会发明新的一些tactics 来找一些可以沟通的那些方法但是你所说的就是海外的人，他们说不一样的语言他们说不一样的方言，然后他们都在讨论中国真的是什么东西其实这个我没有很深入的了解，但是我也想到我们看清末年的那些革命者，他们在想一想中国真的是什么，他们常常在海外，他们在讨论这个问题，因为我们看那些就是国家的认同，他们常常是跟比较的国家其他的国家比较的所以我想其实我不太清楚他们对于语言有什么想法，但是我还是认为以后比如说Republic of China 他们那就是中央政府，他们认为这个是一个问题，因为我们看他们的课本，就是有很多课本他们是教那个国音国语，他们是非给那些海外在南洋在南洋的那些华侨的一些人来学国语，所以我想我所说到的，在某一方面，有人说中国其实是一个多元的，就是怎么说民族主义是多元的，有很多不一样的方法来发表发挥你自己的 identity， 你自己的个性可以说广东话，可以说闽南话，可以说国语什么所以看孙中山，看那些革命者，他们就是很明显，他们是想到中国，想到是中国是一个多元的一个典范，但是还有政府，还有那些我所说的 homogenizing forces， 就要强迫中国当一个就是homogeneous 怎么说单质的一个国家，单质的一个个性他们其实还在海外还有影响的。然后你所提到的那些新加坡80年代的那些就是国语运动，其实也是这样的那些冲突，我想但是非常的感谢你的评论。
吉娜刚才就是回答的，就是让我想一想，如果我们就是考虑印度的现象，就是印度也是一个多种语言的一个国家，那印度在殖民地的时候，有好多个就是那个来自不同的那个印度的不同的地方的那个可能是科学家，可能是政治学家，他们怎么沟通？那我发现，那他们可能用英文，所以就是那个殖民地，就是那个英国的那个语言，所以让我是想起来呢，孙中山和其他的这样的就是人物，他们除了那个用中国的语言， 有其他的语言能用吗？因为我有另外一个就是研究题目，现在就是做的那个研究，关于中国和印度的那个科学家，他们有什么样的合作？就是从20世纪30年代到80年代左右这样的一个阶段内，我发现他们不是用英文，也不是当然不是用中文或者印度的各种语言，他们常常用的是拉丁语和德文，因为德文10年代、20年代是科学的，就是最重要的那个语言。所以这个是另外一个就是比较有意思的一个方面，我觉得。
那我回答吗？
可以。
对，那我就回答一下，我看到了 Gina 提了一个问题，对吧？那我就简单的回答一下，这个 Vietnam War 和这个 Korean War， 对，这个越战打了很久，像其中一个问题呢，也是关于战俘的，所以 Nixon 他1972年去北京，他去跟周恩来谈，他其中一个就是希望中国给越南人压力，让他们早点释放这个他们这些美军战俘，比如说 McCain 这样的人。但是周恩来突然就非常生气，他就说：“你要讲战俘，我还是讲一下朝鲜战争。这件事情我们不提了，但是我们不会忘记的。就是他公开再也不讲，但是唯一一次他私下的，他告诉这个美国人。但后来这个1973年的时候，美国和北越在巴黎签署这个和平协议，其中一条就是说所有战俘立即回国。”所以他以前在韩战中提出这个所谓的 voluntary repatriation 这种自愿遣返的原则根本就不成立，所以说美国人后来永远也不提这个事情，所以后来他们也意识到这是个错误，你不可能给战俘选择，他关在监狱里，他怎么可能自由的表达自己的意见？所以再也不讲这个事情，所以美国政府从来不会讲这个朝鲜战争最后这个所谓的宣传胜利，对美国人来说是根本，他们意识到这是个错误，但他也不会公开的说我们错了。OK，
还有另外一个反应就是兰大师现在就是讲的那个统计方面的我觉得好多我们就是一项统计的时候，我们常常会觉得呢以人口为主来做调查。那我觉得我做那个50年代统计在大陆统计公司的那个研究的时候，我发现人口不是最重要的一个研究题目，所以他们要研究的是那个社会方面，就是经济方面的各种各样的东西。人口不包括人口包括人口，但是人口不是最重要的。这个我也觉得是挺有意思的，也可能是一个那个social statistics， 就是那个社会主义下的那个统计的一个特点。
如果我可以再追问 Aaron 的话，那你有没有注意到，在1945年之前 ，Republic of China 他们的统计是什么样的一个情况？也有这样子，就是像你刚刚所说的，特别看重人，特别应该说他不重视人口，还是他比较看重人口，或者是说这个 Republic of China 他们的那个时代受到的这个统计观念的影响，是不是从不同的地方而来的？
对，所以那个。对，不就是那个45年之后，就是可以说从20年代就是一开始，他们受到的那个影响就是有各种各样的影响，就是所以包括那个，所以他们说那时候他们说那统计不是一个独立的一个专业，也算是一个就是那个一个工具。所以无论是科学还是社会科学、自然科学和什么其他的那个研究方向，都可以来用。所以这个肯定是一个也可以说是来自西方的一个影响。所以而且最根本的就是问题是怎么把统计怎么定义，在基本上统计是什么样的一个是一个独立的一个专业，还是一个科学、自然科学和社会科学这样的一个问题。所以在45年之后，就是那个世界第二战那个结束之后，对他们的最大的那个挑战就是把那个统计工作恢复，因为那个在30年代末一开始就是统计工作已经受到了那个战争的那个影响。 所以呢，第一个问题就是怎么恢复那个统计工作。
对，我也有一个问题想问大家一下。所以我们今天的会议的 subtitle 是 The View from 2020 2020年的展望，而且我个人认为三位演讲者的研究跟现在中国与世界的关系都有很密切的关系，无论是在疫情的情况之下，统计学的政治化，或者是香港、内蒙古、新疆和其他地方有关语言和政治的问题，或者是韩战对现在东亚地区的政治局面的影响。所以我想问一下，你们认为您的研究如何能帮我们了解现在的这些情况？而且你觉得是作为历史学者，我们应该怎么回应今天的这些挑战？我也说知道这不是一个很简单的问题，
非常简单的一个问题。
我可以先说一下哦 ，Erna， 你要先说还是？其实我常常想一想，我的研究跟现在的这个很特别的一个 moment 有什么关系？其实我想我可以想到2个，第一个就是比较具体的从去年开始，香港有这样的很大的示威，然后他们那些就是示威活动之内，他们常常说广东话就是我们的特别香港的个性的之一。有一个在香港的学者，他说 Cantonese is the language of protest， 所以他们就是把这些训示从中国历史来的那些训示就是政治语言这些政治的那些含义，就变成一个示威的所以我想我的研究就可以帮我们更明白那些香港他们在发明他们自己的 identity 自己的认同的过程，因为在某一方面在香港有一个特别的香港人的 identity， 就是 Hong Konger identity， 香港人我们不是中国人，我们是香港人这个算是一个民族，算是一个国家，其实不。当然有那些现象，但是大部分的不是一个nationalism 的一种的一种现象。我想他们在说我们是华人，我们是汉人，我们是中国人，但是我们不要让共产党就把那个中国人就是那个定义中国人的定义就稳定一下，我们有其他的就是想法，就是做一个中国人有什么意思？所以说广东话，他们常常说就是比如说广东话是更古代，更就是有古代的历史比普通话的历史更古代的，所以他们我想我们看那些示威的 rhetoric， 示威者的他们所讲的，可以看一下他们在 reclaim what it means to be Chinese。第二个我想跟现在有关系的是现在比如说我在美国美国跟中国现在他们的关系越来越就是差，真的还有现在我们的政府是 川普的政府和 Mike Pompeo 他们常常说中国跟美国我们的关系就是文明冲突，就是那些 clash of civilizations。 然后我们在讲中国，我们常常讲中国像它是一个单制的一个国家，就是中国人是这样子，是我们的 discourse 有关中国的 discourse 常常是他们是 homogeneous。 然后我的研究是说，如果我们真的要理解中国，我们要 让那些多元的想法就发挥起来因为他们就是对于中国是什么，中国人是什么，这是谁，就是我们要理解中国，我们要知道他们不是一个单制的国家还有我们想就是共产党的政府跟中国人他们的关系，其实我想就是有美国政府，有国务院，然后有共产党，他们都是同意如果我们看一下中国是单制的，所以但是在日常生活可以看一下，中国人不太同意这个想法，所以在我来看，如果我们要真的明白就是政府跟社会的他们的关系，我们要知道就是那些 homogenizing rhetoric 其实不太正确的。Thank you
我听你的演讲之后，我觉得非常有意思的是，好像在20世纪初，这来自南方的这些知识分子觉得广东话和其他南方的方言最能够代表中华的文化，或者是最纯粹的中华文化，但是好像现在想保持广东话的政治意义是很不一样的，因为在一定的程度上，支持在香港用广东话是跟中华文化做一种对立，所以觉得这种转变是非常有意思的。
真的是很有意思的，而且在我本书，我谈的就是我简单的谈一下，但是我现在在写一篇文章是比较注意到这个问题。我想就是在就是20世纪初南方的语言就是说南方的语言，他们常常想他们自己的语言是比较单纯的，因为他们在想一想，就是汉民族，他们是从一个来源来的，一个 origin， 然后他们在这个时期，就是皇帝的这个时期，他们都说一样的语言，然后就是时间过了，然后人都搬到其他的，就是一搬到其他的地方，然后他们开始说不一样的语言按照那些人，有一些地方他们是比较保持那些就是那个汉民族来源的这个语言，然后有一些人他们是跟那些北方的其他的民族混在一起，所以他们的语言不太pure 所以有一些种族就是 racial rhetoric 来说这些，然后现在大部分我认为那些就是有政治味道的那些的这些说法，在香港，在广州其实他们常常会这么说，比如说他们会说共产党要我们都说普通话，但是普通话的历史不太就是很现在的，广东话有很长的历史就是如果你把那些就是阅读那些唐诗或者那些古代的那些文章，你可以看广东话比较适合那些古代的materials 所以他们还是利用这个想法，但是他们不一定会用这样的 racial rhetoric。Yeah， 但真的很有意思，我想。
Yeah， 我讲一下，我想讲一下这个和今天什么关系，对不对？像我的书里像我本来开始写书的时候没有想到这个问题，为什么美国人会采取这样一个政策，这是非常愚蠢的，对中国战俘进行洗脑，他并不想把中国战俘给他们这个所谓的 political asylum， 当然从来没想把他们接到美国来，那只能送到台湾去。但当时美国人是已经准备要抛弃蒋介石，他们绝对不愿意把他送到台湾来。后来这个结果是完全没有想到的。但他为什么会这样做呢？所以后来我写书的时候就跟我以前的博士论文很大不同，得出一个结论，就是但是也很简单，就是说有2个原因 ：ignorance about the Chinese communists and arrogance toward the Chinese people， 就对中国和中国人的轻视。第2个是对中国人的无知。像这个当然任何时候都可以有解释力的，今天也是这样的。比如说 Trump 他搞了4年， 说的他好像他很容易把中共给打败，根本就没有，贸易战是彻底失败的，一事无成。但同样的，在台湾、在香港，这所有的反对中共的力量，他们都实际上是川普在台湾和在香港是非常受欢迎的，这是非常奇怪的一个现象。因为他们就认为美国人就可以，只要他愿意就可以把中共就打败了，这是根本不可能的。在韩战的时候，中国比美国弱很多，美国都不能打败中国。到了今天，难道说就像 Pompeo、川普这样光是靠嘴巴说就能把中共打败吗？实际上这是非常愚蠢的，是根本不可能的。美国自己是不可能的，所以这是 ignorance about the Chinese communists。像他们是非常复杂的，共产党不是那么简单的，不是你喊口号就可以打败的。蒋介石没有打败，美国人也没有打败，过去没有，将来也不会的。同样，在背后上是一种 racism 对中国人的，但这不只是今天的所谓共和党，这不是什么党的问题。比如 George Kennan， 他1949年说过一句非常著名的话，他说 China never be strong, they'll never be powerful。当然，现在证明他是彻底错误的。不管中国是国民党或者是共产党什么党，中国都可以变得很强大的。但这就是像川普他们这样的人，还想回到过去 make America great again， 这是根本不可能的事情。但是如果在其他国家的人民还想去利用川普这样的人来做事的话，那是完全是所托非人，这是非常可悲的一个现象。像背后，像它核心的意思，这 ignorance about the Chinese communists and the arrogance toward the Chinese people， 像背后很简单就是 racism。他们想 racism 好像没什么，只是国内的问题，它不是个国内的问题，是个国际的问题。这种种族主义的思想会造成你的决策是彻底的失误的。今天我们看川普做了4年，他唯一做到的是把美国给搞垮了，中共已经比以前更强大了。这就是我想今天看的话，这是非常重要的。Racism is very costly， 这是有代价的，并不是无代价的。OK。
好，那我就是很简单的就是说一下，Jack 你提到的那个从2020年的角度，怎么就是看可能是新的那个调整，怎么就是那个中国的那个研究中国的历史，怎么能就是帮我们了解和面对那个未来的那个挑战。我觉得从统计的角度来讲，最重要的那个挑战应该是那个数据的挑战，就是我们已经可以说进入了那个数据的一个时代，也可能是可以说进入了怎么说呢，人工智能的一个时代，就那个 artificial intelligence 的一个时代。所以我们而且从我的研究，我就是那个做研究的时候，我就是发现了，我们现在有一个怎么说呢，尤其是那个搞那个数据的，搞那个大数据的那个 big data 的科学家，他们都有一个就是非常大的一个自信感。那我们把无论是什么样的问题，世界上有什么挑战、什么问题，如果我们有了那个数据，我们把所有的问题可以解决。我觉得这样的一个自信感不是一个新的一个东西。如果你看50年的情况，你看那个19世纪末的那个情况，非常相同的这样的一个自信感。所以这个我觉得是一个我们要理解的，我们要意识到的一个非常重要的一个，就是历史给我们讲的，历史给我们教的一个非常重要的一个lesson。所以这个我觉得是最重要的一个所以而且因为中国大陆现在就是非常非常重视那个人工智能，所以我们必须要就是考虑他们怎么用。你已经谈了那个谈过了新疆的情况、内蒙古的情况，所以他们已经开始用那个人工智能来控制新疆。所以我不知道就是未来会怎么样，但是这个我们必须要用那个统计的那个长期的那个历史来理解这个新的就是现象。
现在在 chat 里面我们也有2个问题，第一个问题也是问 Arnav。
对，所以我 should I read the question out for everyone or is it?
Sure, go ahead.
So this is from Kigor or Qgor. I have a question. I haven't read your book, referring to my book. So if your book has already covered this, please excuse me. I was wondering if Professor Ghosh discussed the role of statistics, the role statistics played in the design and or implementation of planned economy in China. So short answer is yes. I do discuss it in the book, but not in a very sustained way. This is partly because of the approach that I took, which was really an internalist approach to look at statistics from the perspective of statisticians and not from the perspective of planners. So there is a discussion of planning. There's a chapter where I look at statistical work, where I go into what the relationship between the Statistical Bureau and the planning, sort of the State Planning Commission was. And interesting things do emerge. But as I suggested in the talk, one of the things is that one of the interesting things that emerges is that statistics and the Statistical Bureau were really subservient to the State Planning Commission. So they were kept, unless you were at the very elite level, so people like Shui Muqiao, Wang Sehua, so the top leadership in the Stats Bureau, they may have had some involvement in planning, but otherwise the statistical apparatus was kept largely outside of the purview of the Planning Commission. And this was, I think, on purpose. In some ways, the most, I think, evocative example of this, I guess, is when you look at the actual physical location of the State Planning Commission and the State Statistical Bureau, the headquarters in Beijing. They were in the same building, but the State Planning Commission was on a floor above the State Statistics Bureau. And that sort of hierarchy, physical hierarchy, was actually replicated throughout the country, where at every level, from Beijing to provincial capitals to counties to down to the villages, when you looked at, it was always the planning committee was always, in terms of its status, above the statistics committee.
Great, thank you. And we also have a question for Gina. Sorry, the character is a little small.
I can read it out.
Oh, go ahead. Thanks, Gina.
请问你如何看待中国大陆民间对粤语的包围运动，或者说这种运动与香港同类性行动的异同？对，其实这个是很有意思的问题，而且这个在广东是包围粤语的这个活动，其实我在我书谈一点点，还有我有一个如果我可以就是分享一下这个图片，你们可以看一下吗？这个图片吗？
看得到。
看得到哈，所以这个是2010年的一个示威，他们在广州市，他们有一个示威，就是保护广东话，所以他的牌子说我爱广东话，所以然后这个是广东话的一个说法，就是唔識普通話，所以普通話這個不好意思，我的粵語非常非常差的，但是那個就是保冬瓜就聽起來好像普通話，所以他說我不能說普通話，這個示威是因為那個我 stop sharing OK 是因為他們要就是那個市政府要改變那個電視節目的他們的 programming， 就是把那個粵語的這些電視節目減少了，然後那個普通話就是加入那些普通話的節目，然後很多人他們是抗議的，其實這個示威是有成功的，因為那個市政府他們決定他們不會改變那個電視節目的打算，但是對我來看有一個相同的一個地方，然後有一個不一樣的一個地方第一個相同的一個地方就是那些在廣州的他們的示威者，他們的 narrative， 他們的故事跟香港的很相似的，就是我愛說廣東話，因為是我個性的一部分。然後他有很多文章在這個時期，在2010年在網上有很多文章，他們說我們要保衛廣東話，因為廣東話也是一個遺物就是是對歷史很有價值的，所以我們要保護他們因為普通話是比較現代的一個語言，是 跟中国历史有比较不太就是明显的关系，所以这个故事跟香港的很相同的，但是差别对我来说就是政府的回应，因为政府其实他们的回应在广州，就是他们是尊重他们所说的这个就是保卫方言的这个目的，就是他们同意的。我认为他们同意的是因为他们是说就是保卫方言不是完全跟他们自己政府的目的不是就是没有冲突的。他们不是说要消灭方言，他们是说有一个 hierarchy， 有一个不平等的关系，所以他们常常会说有普通话有方言，一个是全国的共同语，一个是历史的遗产。所以有一些人说我们要保护方言，共产党常常会说对，我们要保护方言但是在香港，因为有那些政治的含义，他们是在抗议共产党的力量，他们常常会说是我们说广东话共产党常常会把这个看成是一个是威胁他们的力量，是威胁他们的 power， 所以他们会所以在香港在广州他们说对，保护方言是遗产，然后在香港在2016年他们有一个就是比较复杂的，但是有一个人说这一个从大陆来的一个教育 educational consultant， 他说广东话不是母语，这不能算是你们的母语，因为是方言，方言不是语言，所以就是一个是语言的分支，不是语言。然后很多香港人说怎么可以这么说，当然广东话是我母语然后有他们的牌子说 mother speak 广东话，因为是母语，是 mother's language 所以我想就是中央政府把香港看成是就是分裂主义的这样的味道，但是看广州他们不是这么想，那是我自己的看法谢谢你们的很好的问题。
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from our chair, Professor Chen Qiufan, for David, if you want to go ahead and take that one.
Yeah, so the question is about the Koreans' view about the POWs in the Korean War and the present. North Korean view, we don't know. So South Koreans, actually, I work with 3 colleagues in Korea. In South Korea, so we work on the POWs who choose to go to neutral countries. They went to India, then eventually some went to Argentina, Brazil. So because I don't read Korean, but I heard from them, actually there hasn't been much study on the Korean prisoners, other than the recent work by Monica Kim, 2019, who is a Korean American. So in Korea, one of the big problems is that those anti-communist prisoners who choose to stay in Korea, they were very ardent anti-communists, and they were extreme conservatives. So most of the liberal academia or this professor, they don't want to deal with these people. So this is, like most societies, Korea is very polarized. So there hasn't been much study. Actually, Monica Kim's work probably is the first one in English scholarship involving oral history interview with a prisoner. But I haven't heard any systematic studies on them. So in Korea, at least among scholars, I don't think there's too much scholarship until recently. There's scholarship on the prisoners who chose to go to neutral nations because they felt these people who choose neutrality would enable them to transcend the politics. But as it turned out, after we interviewed the people, actually most of these people choosing neutral countries, actually they were mostly self-styled anti-communists, but they chose not to stay in South Korea for various reasons. So, or they were not that ideological, does not mean they have no ideology. So it's very complicated, but in Korea, actually also Sheila Miyoshi Yager, in her book, she covers these prisoners who, but they're not the prisoners who, North Korean defectors, but she covered the stories of a couple of prisoners who were South Korean prisoners captured by North Korea, and they eventually returned to South Korea, and their plight, I mean, they also had a very hard time in South Korea. So yeah, there hasn't been too much study, but again, in South Korea, it's also forgotten. Actually, many people were prisoners because Korea, a lot of back and forth fighting. Actually, one of my collaborators, this professor, he's a professor at Seoul National, and his former professor, a sociologist, was a prisoner. But throughout his life, he did not tell anybody much about it. Everybody knew he was once captured by, actually he was serving the North Korean army. Yeah, he was drafted by the North Korean army, and he was captured by the South. Eventually he released because he was Southerner, so he stayed in the South. But he did not talk about it. Even before he died, there was no oral history interview. So I think a lot of opportunities had been lost, even in Korea. It's like everywhere else. They were forgotten. Yeah. Thank you. But I have a question for Gina. Actually, I'm very curious about this promotion of the Mandarin or 普通话, right? Because I interview a lot of the soldiers, and they're very old, mostly speak their local dialects still. But I wonder if had there been any kind of promotion in the army, either in the Nationalist Army or in the People's Liberation Army, any kind of effort to teach them speak standard or 普通话? I'm just curious about this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in sort of the early 50s, they had like a list of priorities of where they wanted to focus language reform, and the military was number one. This would have been after the Korean War, though, because the language reform, like you have a committee meeting in 1949, but it's not until like 52, 53 that they start to settle on everything. And before that, you have a lot of different sort of elements of it. And so, but like that was definitely sort of at the top of their list because they knew that they needed, like, you can't obey commands if everyone speaks different languages, right? And so that was sort of the idea there. And then number two was schools. So it went military schools and then service people and media people. And so then that was sort of the hierarchy. So I don't know how this functioned in the Korean War. As far as the nationalists go, they mentioned that. But the best of my knowledge and research is that the Kuomintang Dengfu, like, they had a lot of ideas. They didn't execute any of them well. So I don't have any specific knowledge of that. I will, however, because I think this is a really fascinating corollary, which is not about the military, but I think it speaks to this. So I talked a bit to an old professor of mine who was sent down during the Cultural Revolution. He was from Beijing, and he went into the countryside, right? And like when he was in Beijing, everyone was like, speak 普通话, it's the language of the revolution, it's what you have to speak. But then when he got into the countryside, they were like, you need to learn from the peasants, you need to speak the local language. And so I think that speaks to the fact that there was really a huge gap in rhetoric and practice. My understanding now is that has changed. I know less about the military than I know about education, but certainly there are really, really strict standards for being a teacher, and I would presume is the same for the military, although I know a lot less. But in the 50s, to me, my best guess is that there was just this big gap between rhetoric, military needs to be number one priority, and practice, which is that there were often other priorities besides teaching people to speak language when they were fighting a war. So.
Can I ask a follow-up question, which links all three of our works? Actually, I'm very interested in the interpreters of language, because the neutral nation custodian force in Panmunjom, right? So the India sent about 6,000 troops to Korea to administer the prisoners' final 180 days in Panmunjom. And some of the Indians, actually, they spoke Chinese. They talked to the prisoners. in Chinese. How did they learn Chinese? Because they were Chinese army in India during World War II. Right? They were in Ramgarh for training, so there were a lot of interaction between the Chinese and the Indian. So somehow some of these Chinese-speaking Indian soldiers or maybe officers by now, they went to India. So, and several of them were prisoners of the Japanese. So they're released and they're still serving the army. So they went to Pyeongchang and they can communicate with the prisoners. Some prisoners spoke Japanese. So this is just fascinating. But of course, I don't know if there's any way to track them down. I'm sure most of them pretty much passed away if they were officers back then, right? So is there any record of this?
Well, Cao Yin, who teaches at Tsinghua University in Beijing, he is, I guess, one of the few Chinese scholars of South Asian history on the mainland. And he has been doing a lot of research on the Chinese during the Second World War, Chinese in India during the Second World War. So, and he's done research on the military base in Ramgarh, and also I think was it out of Lahore or somewhere in present-day Pakistan, basically a fighter plane squadron that was trained, again, for the Chinese this is the Kuomintang Air Force and so on. So he would be the person who would know, I think, what was going on. And I wonder also to what extent some of these people were people who especially if they're from Calcutta or Bombay, where there were already existing at that point, very large Chinese migrant communities. You know, so at least Calcutta's Chinatown pre-62 was actually quite large. So those could be some, but he would be the person to check with. Well, Gina might have other answers, but Cao Yin at Tsinghua University would be.
No, that's a fascinating question. I'm so interested, but I have zero information to share. So thank you for that.
We're almost out of time, but we probably have time for maybe one more question. If anyone has anything they want to get off, anyone get off? Go ahead.
Question for David. I was wondering, you provided these beautiful sort of essentially character studies through your case studies of different people, different backgrounds, and the kinds of experiences they had, during the war and then as prisoners of war and then afterwards. But I was wondering, there is a sense also in terms of that there were a lot of former Kuomintang soldiers who were seconded into the armies that actually fought. And to what extent can we make larger sort of or draw broader conclusions from that about the kinds of loyalties you see amongst the prisoners of war? Do you see a straightforward pattern between what the origins of these soldiers were to the preferences that then they demonstrated when they were POWs?
Actually, yes and no. I think overall for the 21,000 prisoners, I think about 60% of them were former nationalist soldiers. But that doesn't make them loyal to nationalists, right? Because they serve for various lands that have vastly different experiences. But it's true among those hardcore anti-communists. Vast majority of them were former nationalists. Mm-hmm. And for the common soldiers, I don't think there's a direct link, because among the 7,000 prisoners who returned to China, many of them, about 2/3, had the similar. I mean, demographically, they're almost the same, almost identical. But the leaders, those hardcore leaders, communists, that were hardcore veterans, communists, nationalists. But for the common prisoners, is largely by contingency. If they were placed in certain camp, were already controlled by the anti-communists, they had very difficult to escape, unless you're totally committed to great risk to want to go back to China, or if you happen to be in other camp, if you want to escape, you might get killed. So for the leaders, maybe it's true, but for the overall operation, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, I think we're just about out of time. So I just want to one more time thank Gina, Arnav, and David for really fantastic presentations. Thank you all so much. I learned so much from your talks and the discussion. I know everyone else did as well. 然后我要再次感谢各位在星期六早上或者星期五晚上拨空来参加我们的会议。 好的，我们到此就结束了，谢谢大家，拜拜。
谢谢。